Hello, everybody, and good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night. My name is Christian Morsink, the current president of the Global Water Alliance. Welcome to this conference. This special conference on water and peace was scheduled actually for April and was meant to be our second one in 2020. Following our 13th annual conference in January held in Kolkata, India. However, COVID-19 had led to postponement, and like so many others in the world, we had to adopt to a whole new way of communicating through online conferencing, which is for us a new format. This conference is a collaborating effort with the engineering school at Drexel and the water center at Penn. We also are very grateful to our sponsors who kept providing their support when we decided to go online. Thanks to our sponsors, we were able actually to waive the registration fees. Again, thank you very much. This conference has been approved as a preparatory event of the World Water Forum in Senegal in 2021. Mr. Abdoulaye Sene of the forum's secretariat will join us later in the program. The conference will also be reported to the United Nations Association of the United States of America as a United Nations 75 global consultation event, as was planned in April earlier this year. I look forward to a most informative conference. It's a pleasure to introduce Professor Mira Olsen at Drexel University, who will welcome you on behalf of Drexel University and inform you about the rest of the proceedings. I hope you will enjoy, like me, the coming event. Thank you.
Thank you, Christian, and welcome everyone. We're thrilled to see so many of you here and want to thank you for following us on this long journey from the planned event to where we are here today. Drexel Peace Engineering is proud to be a co-host of this event. The theme of this conference is water and peace, and I think you'll see from this remarkable group of speakers and panelists why we are so committed to keeping this event going in some form. There are so many tools available to us today to help create peace and security around water, through inclusive governance, policy, technology, grassroots collaboration, data, and you're going to hear today from some of the best to share advances and innovation in those realms. So we invite you to really tune in, to think creatively, to ask questions, and to join us in creating the same inspiring and engaging experience that we have come to love and expect from our GWA conferences. I want to go over some logistics. I think this is where I'd normally be pointing out the exits and the restrooms, but instead I'm going over Zoom logistics. Please keep yourselves muted with your videos off during presentations. We welcome and very much encourage your questions at any point during the presentations. Please through the chat function addressed to everyone. We will compile these and we'll send them along to our speakers so they can address them during the Q&A sessions. We've given our speakers shamefully little time to present their work and instead want to give you the opportunity to draw on their expertise through questions. Full bios of all of our speakers are available on the GWA conference website, and I'll post a link to that very shortly. We encourage you to please use the Zoom renaming function to identify yourself and your organization so we can see who's here. And as a reminder, you've noticed we're recording this session. The recording and the PowerPoint slides will be available on the GWA site in a few short days. And lastly, I hate to even have to say this, but in case of any kind of interference or Zoom bombing, we will immediately shut down the meeting and we'll send out a new link to all the registered emails through Eventbrite. So it is now my distinct pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Dr. Clive Lipton, who is the director of the Center for Transboundary Water Management at the Arava Institute for Environmental Studies in Israel, and a champion for water cooperation in the Middle East. So with that, Clive, I see you. Please go ahead and share your screen and get us started.
Thank you very much, Mira, and to everybody. It's a real honor to be able to present at this very important conference. As Mira says, there's not much time, so I'll do my best to just provide food for thought for the participants on the intersections of water and peace based on the work that I do here in Israel and in the Middle East. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and get started with my presentation. Okay, so we're talking about a call to action, and I will be discussing as a case study from the Middle East some paradigms for how to better manage watersheds through the promotion of peace, especially in times of conflict and or stress. When we think about transboundary dynamics, this is a quote that I like to use from the United Nations Development Program. This might be something that is sort of self-evident, but I think it's important to spell it out as well, saying the following: we live in a hydrologically interdependent world where 2 in every 5 people in the world live in river and or lake basins that are shared by 2 or more countries. By the way, this is not only relating to surface water, but of course, transboundary dynamics relates very much also to groundwater. Something like 145 countries with more than 90% of the world's population share transboundary water basins. And for a significant proportion of these countries, with something like 800 million people, at least half of their water originates beyond their borders. So this transboundary dynamic, this transboundary reality makes water resource management inherently a political issue as much as it might be one revolving around hydrology, engineering, ecology, or other concerns. Now, because of this transboundary dynamic and countries having to share water or to have to figure out means of allocating water, in many cases, these are countries that share river basins or other watersheds, but don't have, let's say, the best political relations with each other. Adding to this challenges of growing water scarcity, these political and scarcity issues can lead or exacerbate conflict. Kofi Annan said earlier on that there is a potential relationship between water and conflict, and that fierce competition for fresh water may well become a source of conflict and wars in the future. So this specter of water and conflict has been with us for a while, going back at least to 2001. But really, I think the evidence out there, and especially in the work that I do, is water is really more a catalyst for cooperation and peace building than it is one for conflict. And that, I think, is a very important concept and theme that we can discuss within this conference. So to dive right into the work that I do, I work in Israel. I'm from Israel. But I work transboundary with Israel's neighbors, primarily Palestine and Jordan, that are the other 2 main riparian states to the Jordan River watershed. This is a map of the watershed. There are 5 riparian states that all have a percentage of their territory within the basin. The upstream countries are Lebanon and Syria. Then we have Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinian territories of the West Bank. That make up the riparian states of this system. Now, the Jordan River watershed is a very small system, but it's extremely significant because it's the most significant source of surface water available in this region, which is one of the world's most driest regions, where water scarcity is already a fact, both due to climate change impact as well as growing water demands due to increases in population amongst the different countries in the region. Now, this is a system that has undergone many challenging political issues over the years. Most significantly was the year 1967. Prior to 1967, Israel had no political relations with its neighbors. And basically, Israel was in an active state of war with its neighbors. And so there wasn't an ability to develop or to think about regional management of water resources in the region. And this led to unilateral development of the system, specifically by Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and Syria. Most critically was the large out-of-basin diversion of water from the upper parts of the Jordan River system, the Sea of Galilee region, which was the manifestation of the national water carrier built by Israel, and a similar diversion project, but within basin diversion project that was undertaken by Jordan on the eastern side of the system, which is called the King Abdullah Canal. So the political status of the situation at that time preempted any abilities for thinking about more appropriate regional types of water management in the basin. After 1967, and I'm relating specifically to the Six-Day War that Israel fought with the Arab countries around her. After that conflict ended, Israel basically becomes the hydrologically dominant player in the region, the hegemon in the region, because it captures vast amounts of territory that also included most of the significant areas of water resources. Specifically in the north, as you see up there, the Golan Heights region of Syria. So Israel now has control since 1967 of most of the upstream water flows into the system, and of course control over the West Bank area with the access to greater groundwater resources as well. So hydrologically and politically, things changed very dramatically after the 1967 Six-Day conflict between Israel and the Arab countries. Now, one of the challenges of unilateral development and the inability to develop regional ways of thinking about water due to the inability for countries to engage with one another, as was the case up until the late 90s, was large environmental degradation of the system. Because of the large unilateral diversion projects, both out of basin and within basin projects, the Jordan River basically ceased to flow as a natural system. And this led to what I would say is the region's most challenging environmental problem, which is the declining levels of the Dead Sea. The Jordan River was providing most of the flow to the system. Now that that system is being diverted for anthropogenic uses, the Dead Sea Basin is shrinking at an alarming rate. So some of the consequences of unilateral action is large-scale or potential large-scale environmental degradation. And you can see here how the Dead Sea has changed from the 1960s. Here we have the Dead Sea split into two basins in the early 2000s. And this is a projection of what will happen by the year 2050 if we're not able to restore water flows either naturally or through other processes into the system. Things changed dramatically though in the 90s, where Israel and Jordan and the Palestinians begin to overcome some of the political differences that they face. And this led to a breakthrough which also had huge impacts for water management in the region. So in 1994, Israel and Jordan signed a peace treaty, and a significant section of that peace treaty was a view to resolve the water allocation issues between them. And here you see two of the architects of that treaty, Rabin and King Hussein of Jordan, negotiating over the water allocations of the Jordan River system. This picture was taken in Israel on the shores of the Sea of Galilee. We also have a process that engaged Israel and the Palestinian Authority, which expanded about the 10-year period from around 1993 to 2003, what is called the Oslo Accords. Now, a major difference between the Oslo Accords or the Oslo process and the peace treaty with Jordan is that this is not a treaty, because Israel was coming to agreements with a non-state actor, a non-sovereign, and was actually negotiating with the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which led to the creation of the Palestinian Authority. So under this agreement, certain aspects of water allocations were agreed to between Israel and the Palestinian Authority. But unlike a treaty, no formal water rights could actually be engendered, because there was no state actor on the Palestinian side. So the Oslo process has been quite problematic over the years. And as you can see here, we have some points of departure from that process, because the West Bank and Gaza Strip are still considered to be occupied territory. Therefore, the laws of war apply, such as the Hague regulations and the Geneva Convention. So unlike Jordan, we still have many challenges vis-a-vis water allocation between Israel and the Palestinians, up until sovereignty or some kind of sovereignty can be established for a Palestinian state, which will then allow us to formalize some of these agreements into an actual treaty. Nevertheless, I think that there is some real signs of optimism on how a cooperation over water in our region can lead to breakthroughs, even when we still have many challenging political issues beyond water, specifically between Israel and the Palestinians. So what in the time that I have left, what I'd like to leave you with are some thoughts of how one can break out of thinking about water as a unilateral, or from a unilateral perspective, which of course makes no sense hydrologically, given the transboundary dynamics of water, as I mentioned at the beginning. So what I would like to propose and leave for people to think about is the following. At the moment, with respect to Israel and the Palestinians, both sides are entrenching nationalistic and unilateral actions with respect to water. Israel views the issue as one of water needs, meaning that we don't want to sign agreements with the Palestinians that are considered political because there is no sovereign Palestine. Rather, we would like to find ways in which we can provide water to the Palestinian population. The Palestinians simply should tell us how much water they need. But for the Palestinians, the narrative is completely the opposite. Palestine is in a process of trying to become a sovereign state. And therefore, what is inherent in their thinking on how to resolve the issues is to get acknowledgement from Israel about sovereignty over water. So the question here for Palestinians is a narrative of water rights versus a narrative of water needs from the Israeli perspective. And the question is, how can you try to find common ground between a water rights narrative and a water needs narrative? So the proposal here is to get the stakeholders to shift their thinking from regionalism, to shift their thinking from nationalism to regionalism. And that is because of the obvious fact that water resources do not conform to political borders, as we've said previously. And can we think about developing countries' national water security, not from unilateral action, as has been the case up until now, but rather from regional management and capacity, even if we have political problems vis-a-vis Israelis and Palestinians. And one way to think about regionalism is to actually identify what are the national capacities countries or regions have to manage water, but to identify or to activate those national capacities within a regional context. And so this is a proposal where I think Israel, Jordan, and Palestine can come together, where each has something to offer that the other does not and potentially needs. So we're moving from unilateralism to regionalism according to the following. Israel, as I think many people probably in the conference know to some degree, is a world leader in water technologies, specifically in terms of irrigation, wastewater treatment, and most significantly, large-scale desalination for domestic drinking water. Jordan, on the other hand, has large land resources for the potential of developing solar radiation for renewable energy. And why is that important? Because if we are going to produce large amounts of water through non-conventional means, such as desalination, energy is a critical factor. And finally, Palestine, the Palestinian territories of the West Bank, but also Gaza, are actually very arable lands, specifically in terms of the areas of groundwater recharge. And therefore, Palestine can act as a natural buffer to protect groundwater as a reservoir of fresh water for times of crisis when we cannot only rely on non-conventional water supplies such as desalination. So the point here is that each party has something to offer that the others can benefit from. And so we can think about a regional proposal which leads not only to national water security, but to regional water security. If we view Israel as a water supplier to the region, to Jordan, the Palestinians, and even beyond, because Israel already has very well-developed desalination capacity along its Mediterranean coast, the energy required to maintain those systems and even to expand them will come from Jordan, because Jordan will provide the renewable energy from its eastern desert regions to keep those desalination facilities to provide the power. And finally, of course, the Palestinians will be the stewards, let's say, of the natural resources, specifically the very high quality groundwater that underlies most of their territory. In other words, the point here is each has what to gain from the other. And so this can therefore be a move to thinking about water security according to a watershed basis, where this is a quote that I came across a while back, but I think it's very relevant for our thinking here of water and peace, is to think about water security along these lines, right? That sustainable access to water has to occur on a watershed basis, even when that watershed has very complex political transboundary dynamics, and this builds water security. Finally, I want to just say a few words about another very important aspect of water and peace, which is not only water and peace at the level of governments, which of course is essential, but water and peace at the local level, bringing people together, people-to-people engagement. And most of my work at my organization is people-to-people engagement, bringing Israelis and Palestinians and Jordanians and others together to improve water access and water supply and quality of life for communities. And this is essential. You cannot have peace only at the levels of government. True, long-lasting, sustainable peace is only going to be derived through strong people-to-people engagement. And so we work in our region to improve access to water, sanitation, through technological means and other means, specifically focusing on communities that we term off-grid. These are communities that are facing in water and sanitation and also energy infrastructure challenges. And so just some very small examples of work that we do in communities throughout the West Bank is to work with local farmers that are struggling with things like high saline brackish groundwater for irrigation, lack of access to sewer networks and wastewater treatment. We bring people together, farmers, community activists, students, local government authorities, and install appropriate small-scale technologies that can improve water access. So what you see here is a simple off-grid grey water treatment and reuse system that is helping to improve water quality and water access to farmers that lack access to water infrastructure. And some of the opportunities for this, to summarize where we want to bring the two sides together, is the following. Our work can help improve water independence for Palestinians at a local level, but also at a national level. This, of course, will improve agricultural development. A significant proportion of the Palestinian population is still either directly or indirectly dependent on agriculture for their livelihoods. Better water management, of course, will improve or will help us mitigate pollution. Quality of life will improve. Anything that can be done to help manage water resources more effectively on the Palestinian side will also then save Israel from having to invest technology to treat that water, because the Palestinians are upstream from Israel. So untreated water from the Palestinian side will eventually flow into Israel. Of course, all of this can help promote economic development, such as job creation. Israelis are able, therefore, to benefit through improved protection of the shared environment, which, of course, includes very significantly the transboundary ground and surface waters. And, of course, both can benefit through better access to information, and this can also allow and encourage the foreign support through improved funding and financing for projects that will benefit both Israelis and Palestinians. So my concluding thoughts with respect to water security and peace are the following. We should think about water as a regional commons. The real borders that matter are hydrological and not political, and we have to really look at our world in that way as helping us to bring our political issues and differences more in to try to bring those into more, to confirm more with the hydrological realities which we face. And very important to think about water management and various projects, not only at the high level of governments, but to very much think about how to appropriately fit water management projects and improvement of water needs within a local context. Because at the end of the day, that's the most important thing, is improving people's lives at the community level. And once you're able to do that, you can begin to scale back up again to improve the political relations amongst the governments. If people see the benefits of collaboration, of cooperation, their lives are better because their water resources are better managed. This is the foundation upon which more formal government-to-government peace agreements can be fostered and engendered. So I hope that I haven't gone too much over time, and I thank you all for your attention. And Mira, I'll turn it back to you if we have some opportunities for Q&A. Thank you very much.
We do. Thank you very much, Clive. We do have a lot of questions for you. And I assure everyone in the audience, if we don't have time to let Clive answer them here, we are going to compile them and send them, and we will have some forum for getting some response back. But a couple, I'm theming them together. One is there any chance to develop solar energy in Palestine, not only in Jordan? And another piggyback to that is, what role can Gaza play in water conservation and using its water access as a vehicle for peace building?
So solar energy is certainly possible in some parts of the West Bank, but the land resources are much more limited, and the topography is more problematic than in Jordan. So the Jordan Valley area of the West Bank is very conducive to solar energy. And actually, we have some projects that already that are generating solar energy. But large-scale solar energy, I think, the production will be more feasible in Jordan than in the West Bank. In terms of Gaza, Gaza is probably the most critical issue with respect to water, because there it's really a humanitarian issue. Gaza has a massively problematic issue with water quality because of large-scale overpumping of the coastal aquifer, which of course is encouraging seawater intrusion. So we have roughly 2 million people in an area of, I think, 60 square kilometers, one of the most highly densely populated areas in the world. So we must improve the humanitarian issue in Gaza. And the most straightforward resolution to what's happening in Gaza is to introduce into Gaza large-scale desalination, similar to what Israel has. And this, unfortunately, is being hampered by the inability of a political horizon between Israel and Hamas, which controls the Gaza Strip. But at the end of the day, that kind of infrastructure must come into Gaza. It's the only viable solution to solving Gaza's water supply. And I do know that there is a lot of engagement to try to make this happen. And time will tell, but it's critical to understand the large humanitarian crisis that's taking place in the Gaza Strip, and that's not good for anybody. It's certainly not good for Israel, as much as it's not good for the population in the Gaza Strip themselves.
Thank you. We have another question on the experience of the three countries in managing the water through the land-water nexus. How are upper and lower watershed stakeholders interacting to keep the peace? And I'll add on to that, do you see a role for municipal actors in contributing to the water management in the Jordan River Valley?
So, yeah, so I mean, at the moment, there is quite a good high level of cooperation between Israel, Jordan, and Palestine, mostly on groundwater management. In terms of regulating pumping, for example, protecting recharge areas so that the long-term water quality is protected. A lot of this happens between the various water agencies. So the ministries of water in the three countries do regularly engage with one another. It's not so straightforward, but there is a lot of open communication on how to specifically protect the aquifer. For example, in the Oslo Accords, both Israelis and Palestinians agreed to a no-harm clause in the agreement for the long-term protection of the aquifer. In terms of, unfortunately, we still don't yet have a complete agreement with all the riparians. We need to still enter into agreements with the upstream actors, Syria and Lebanon. That, unfortunately, is not yet something that is foreseeable in the near future, and that's critical. In terms of municipal actors, a lot of water regulation is at the level of local authorities, both in terms of sewer management and domestic water supply. Water tariffs, for example, and water pricing is all managed at the local level. And so there is a very important role to engage with the municipal actors. One area that still needs a lot of work on the Palestinian side is full cost recovery of water and better management of non-revenue water as well.
Great, thank you. I think we have time for one more, and that's the audience is wanting to get your opinion on the feasibility, possibility of the Red Sea, Dead Sea Canal, linking energy generation to desalination.
Yeah, so that's a very critical issue, and that relates to the slide that I briefly mentioned on the declining levels of the Dead Sea. The Red Sea, Dead Sea concept, I think very much relates to what I was presenting in my talk as thinking about water as a regional commons, because the idea would be that Israel, Jordan, and the Palestinians will all benefit from this project, both in terms of improved access to high quality water and energy and the environmental benefits that would lead to helping to redress the declining levels of the water, declining levels of the Dead Sea. Where we are at the moment is that there is agreement between Israel and Jordan to move forward with the phase 1 of that project, which would desalinate water in southern Jordan, and then take the brine 200 kilometers north into the Dead Sea to see what will be the long-term ecological impacts of the brine discharge into the Dead Sea basin. Both the Israeli and Jordanian governments have approved and agreed on this project. But it's not moving forward, mostly due to disagreements on how the project will be financed and where the finances will come from. But the concept is very much agreed to by everybody. And in my personal opinion, I'm very much a proponent of it. I think it's probably the most viable solution to what we need to do in our region. And if that project were to move forward, it would further support and strengthen this concept of regional security. Because if your water and your energy are coming from your neighbors, you're not going to fight, right? It becomes a zero-sum game at that point. So the potential for conflict, I think, if anything, is actually reduced very significantly in our region through a project such as the Red Dead, which I very much hope to see move forward in the not too distant future.
Thank you. I think many of us are encouraged by your optimism and just the execution of the person-to-person work and its ability to even work in these complex situations and sort of supersede the political environment. So thank you again, Clive. We have many more questions for the audience, which we will compile to everyone. We want to take a break here to thank our sponsors before very quickly, transitions are quick in the cyber world. Moving on to our first panel. So it is my pleasure now to welcome and introduce Charlie Iceland, who will be moderating our first panel. Charlie is Director of Global and National Water Initiatives with the World Resources Institute's Food, Forests, Water, and Ocean program. And he will introduce to you our first panel of speakers.
Okay, can everybody see, can everybody hear me?
You're good.
Okay, and can everybody see me? Because I can't see myself.
We can see you too.
Well, I don't need to see myself. I see myself every day in the mirror. So welcome everyone, and good morning, good evening, depending on where you are. And thank you for joining today's Global Water Alliance 2020 Conference on Water and Peace. My name's Charles Iceland. I'm moderating panel 1, titled Effective Water Management Tools, Case Studies Across Different Regions, highlighting governance, policy, data, and technology strategies for successful water management in support of peace. This will be a 1 hour and 15-minute session. I don't have to introduce myself because I've been introduced. So let me go on to provide a brief overview of the topics to be presented during this panel. Then I'll provide my own brief presentation, and then we'll conclude with, I'll introduce each speaker and have him or her present their presentation, and we'll conclude with a question and answer session. So, panel overview. I'll begin with a short presentation on effective water management tools, case studies across different regions of the developing world. Carol Collier will then follow with a presentation on the Delaware River Basin and how its management can serve as a model for other basins facing similar issues. Shana McLean will then follow with a presentation on the role of Earth observation technologies and how they treat with the topic of water and peace, specifically on NASA's focus on risk reduction and resilience and the connections this has to environmental security. Jared Bales will then present on the role water diplomacy has played in building relationships between nations and the creation of trust through data sharing or the use of technologies that address information gaps. Finally, Bob Muscat will present cases where water engineering projects have been central factors in situations of violent conflict. The cases will illustrate how water projects can prevent or intensify conflicts. So let me go on with my brief presentation. Following, as we need to move through the slides, I'll just say next slide. So I'm going to provide a brief overview of solutions to water insecurity challenges, drawing on case studies from different regions of the developing world. Next slide, please. So our water solutions framework. In a report that Peter Glick, Ayushi Chireddy, and I published earlier this month, we organized water security solutions under 4 broad categories: natural resources, science and engineering approaches, political and legal tools, economic and financial tools, and policy and governance strategies. Next slide, please. Let's review some of these solutions, beginning with natural resources, science and engineering approaches. Next slide, please. Water efficiency and conservation improvements. As sources of water supply have dwindled in many places, there's been an increasing focus on improving water use efficiency, thereby reducing water demand. The water savings generated can then enable new water uses, including boosting environmental flows. These kinds of improvements are available in every sector of the economy and include investment in efficient irrigation technologies, water efficient industrial processes, and methods for reducing food loss and waste, to name a few. Water resource managers in China's Yellow River Basin, for example, are working to replace inefficient flood irrigation systems with much more efficient drip irrigation systems. In Iraq, it is estimated that only about 32% of treated water actually reaches paying customers. In other words, there are water system losses of 68%, either due to leakages in the system or theft. Iraq therefore needs to invest in improved water delivery infrastructure in order to conserve its high value water. Next slide, please. So now let's look at an example of political and legal tools. Next slide, please. Minimum flow requirements. Some tensions over water are related to ecological problems associated with overextraction of surface water and groundwater. In Iran, for example, the drying of numerous lakes and marshes have contributed to local protests over water policy and water allocations. In India and China, many lakes and rivers are also drying up as a result of overextraction of water. The OECD, which is a club of wealthy countries, recently conducted a survey of water allocation regimes in 27 OECD and key partner countries. The survey found that most of these countries had some kind of explicit or enforceable limit or cap on surface water abstractions. Such enforceable use limitations are valuable for managing water users, preventing declines in water tables and the drying up of rivers, and the minimizing of conflict. The international community can help poorer countries establish their own river flow requirements through technical assistance programs. Next slide, please. Now let's look at an example of economic and financial tools. Water pricing. Water prices rarely reflect the true cost of providing it. Increasing prices to reflect the full cost of service could help pay for current operation and maintenance costs while providing reliable financing to improve and expand water infrastructure. Pricing structures should also protect access to safe and adequate water and sanitation, a basic human right, for poor and disadvantaged communities through carefully designed tariffs, subsidies, and/or safety net programs. Next slide, please. Now let's look at an example of policy and governance strategies. Next slide. Stakeholder and community engagement. Broad-based engagement of water users, communities, and other stakeholders in water resources management is required to make informed and legitimate decisions. We need such engagement now more than ever, as climate change and growing demands on natural resources make more people compete for limited water supplies. The Restoration Initiative in Kenya's Tana Delta provides an example of successful engagement with stakeholders. Tensions between local farmers and animal herders over increasingly scarce water and land reached a high point in 2012 when 286 people died in clashes between these communities. By bringing communities together to participate in land use decisions, the Restoration Initiative has helped over 100 villages restore and better manage natural resources, reducing local water tensions. Next slide, please. Barriers to implementation. While we can usually identify solutions to water insecurity challenges, they are often difficult to implement for a number of reasons, including political and economic trade-offs inherent in proposed solutions, problems associated with collective action, such as the issue of free riders who use services without paying for them, scarce financial resources, lack of technical capacity, social or cultural barriers, and widespread and entrenched corruption. These barriers can be overcome with sufficient political will. More research is needed to understand how best to generate political will for this purpose. But in the meantime, we need to target key international, national, and local stakeholders and make the political case to implement necessary but difficult solutions to water insecurity challenges. Otherwise, we will likely see a rising number of water-related conflicts, water scarcity, and flooding-induced displacements of populations in failed states. Next slide, please. There are many other water security solutions and examples of how they have been applied or can be applied, and I hope you have a chance to read about them in our new report. Thank you very much. Okay, now I'm going to go back to put on my moderator hat, and I now have the pleasure to introduce Carol Collier. Carol serves as a senior advisor and government liaison at the Academy of Natural Sciences. One of her main projects is the Delaware River Watershed Initiative, a cross-cutting collaboration working to conserve and restore the waters that supply drinking water to 15 million people in New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware. Ms. Collier served for over 15 years as the executive director of the Delaware River Basin Commission. Carol, the floor is yours.
I think there we go. Trying to find my slides there. Hello, everyone. I am speaking today of the Delaware watershed, which is our watershed here in Philadelphia. Next, please. It is a shared system among 4 states. And while it is states instead of countries, it has been used as the example, an example for water management in China, the Netherlands, along the Danube, Ecuador, to name a few. Next, please. Yep.
Carol, hold tight. We're just fixing the slides.
Okay. Okay. So as you can see, the river actually forms the boundary among the states. So it is a very shared system. And it supplies water to over 15 million people. Half of New York City's water supply, which is the largest metropolitan area in the country. And then it also provides all of the drinking water in Philadelphia. Next, please. It is a small drainage compared to other watersheds, but it's a big working river. It's also the longest undammed river in the eastern part of the country, and is a very used system. Next. It is 80% forested in the upper reaches, known for recreation, and then more and more urban as you work your way down. Next. The resources in the upper watershed, incredible recreation, trout fishing, etc. Next. But it also houses 4 huge reservoirs of New York City, equaling 271 billion gallons of water. And New York City is allowed to export up to 800 million gallons a day out of the basin toward Manhattan. And just for a reference, Philadelphia downstream uses about 300 million gallons a day at most. Next. So this is the issue. We have this water source for New York City up in the headwaters, and it is a non-filtration system because the water quality is so good. But down at the bottom of the basin is Philadelphia and more urbanized areas that is actually located in tidal regions, and they are also dependent on the Delaware and the major tributary, the Schuylkill. Next. It's also the largest freshwater port in the world if you look at Philadelphia, Camden, Wilmington, and other locations. So it is very much a working river down here. Next. The trouble comes with governance. We are in a local rural area of the US where there are over 830 municipalities in the basin, 4 states, 2 EPA regions, etc. So how do you get your arms around trying to manage on a watershed basis? Next. In 1961, this is a picture of President Kennedy signing into law the Delaware River Basin Compact. So it is a interstate federal compact bringing together the governors of the 4 states and a representative of the president. It originally was the Secretary of the Interior, and it is now a just officer in the Corps of Engineers. Next. So this all came about because of water supply disputes, severe pollution down in the Philadelphia area, and also the flood of record in the 1950s. Next. What is important about this, as Clive mentioned, this brings together these decision makers without regard to political boundaries. It's to manage the system on the river's terms using the watershed boundaries. And the compact is quite extensive with the regulatory authority for water quality and quantity. There is an equitable apportionment part of it for a fair distribution of water, but also a lot on planning and management and education. Next. Well, here's where the issues are. As I mentioned, the New York City reservoirs right up in the headwaters, and then Philadelphia's intakes. This is a picture of the original water treatment system in Philadelphia. It's now obviously advanced from that. but they're down here within the tidal region. Next. There have been 2 Supreme Court cases, first starting in 1931, when New York City started talking about having these reservoirs, or more than talking about it, and with a decision by Oliver Wendell Holmes that stated a river is more than an amenity, it is a treasure and needs to be protected. This Supreme Court case was reopened in 1954 when New York City planned the 3rd reservoir. And at that time, there was an operation plan proposed where New York City could take 800 million gallons, but had to release a certain amount to hit a target, flow target downstream. The U.S. Geological Service's river master, or excuse me, head of hydrology became the river master as dictated by the Supreme Court. And then DRBC also has a role. Next. It really came to a head in the 1960s when we had a multi-year drought, and it was realized that if New York City took all the water they were allowed to, there would not be enough fresh water flowing down the river to keep the salt from the bay working its way up into the Philadelphia drinking water intake. And this shows that while the salt line, as we call it, which is the drinking water standard, usually resides down along the Delaware-Pennsylvania line, it had come up to within 8 miles of the Philadelphia drinking water, and there's a 12-mile tidal excursion. So there were significant operation plans put in place. Next. So here we are. There was a lot of fighting. People say water wars are in the West and other places. Not so. There are a lot of water wars in the East. But we came up with a flexible flow management plan, and there's a whole operations for drought management. But then over the years, it has also evolved to look at ecological flow needs and spill mitigation from the reservoirs for reduction of flood impacts. Next. And you can if you've been involved with negotiations, you can understand this. The Supreme Court said you didn't have to come back to the Supreme Court if you could get unanimous agreement among the decree parties, which are the 4 states and New York City. And the negotiations for a unanimous agreement is quite different from a negotiation for a majority. So it's been quite a struggle, but knock on wood, it has worked so far, and there is a significant operation plan in place, even though there are no dams on the main stem. There are also many issues, I won't go through them here, but the point is you do need a system to bring together folks on a watershed basis, because a lot of times the issues can't be solved at the point of concern. Say it's an intake downstream. It takes a watershed approach to solve the problems. And that's where the Basin Commission comes in. But that isn't the whole picture. Next. As Clive said, you need to bring the people together too. And there is another initiative going on in the watershed. It's called the Delaware River Watershed Initiative. And it is looking at those issues that, if I can say, government doesn't do as well. How do we address non-point source pollution from agricultural areas, suburban stormwater? And equally important, how do we protect those forested lands where water quality is really good? And looking at land use decisions, zoning, because what happens on the land really is what affects water quality. Next. So the Delaware River Watershed Initiative was started in 2014. The whole idea is to work across the 4 states, remembering it's one source, to protect that source of water quality for both natural systems and human systems. Next. This has been an incredible opportunity for the area. The We and Penn Foundation, which is a local philanthropic foundation, has put over $100 million to date into this. It is a system built on a backbone of science. The Academy of Natural Sciences, where I work, is the lead for the science initiatives, but many, many others are involved. It is totally bottom up, engaging over 60 organizations. think watershed organizations, land trusts, as well as some of the national organizations, the Nature Conservancy, Natural Lands, etc. There is no regulatory hammer. The whole idea is to engage communities and landowners to be stewards of their local streams. I know there are initiatives such as the Chesapeake Bay where they want folks upstream to change their way they do things in order to improve downstream. But you know, we want people to understand that their local streams are what really matters. And if you take care of the tributaries, the river will take care of itself. Next. It is a network. It's not organizational based. It's really pulling people together. There are all these issues that I've spoken about on the ground efforts, but what really matters is building collaboration. And that's where the We and Penn Foundation has put a lot of money to bring all these diverse organizations together to realize there's only one source. And we're also looking to the future to figure out how to maintain the core values, but really expand the reach. Next. Thank you very much, and I look forward to your questions. Take care.
Okay, thank you, Carol. I'd now like to introduce Shana McLean. Shana is the NASA Earth Science Division's Global Partnerships Manager and the Applied Sciences Advisor on Risk Reduction and Resilience. Shana drives innovation and science with partners including Mercy Corps, Conservation International, Google, and Microsoft. Shana, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Charles. It's a pleasure to be with everyone here today virtually, talking about such an interesting and important topic. What I'm going to speak about specifically is really the environmental element of peace building. With Earth observations, we're talking not just about satellite data, which NASA is clearly known for, but also this suite of other ways of visualizing the Earth through remote sensing, but also the vast networks of sensors that exist around the world that monitor water availability, water height, etc. And also, we're talking about issues related specifically to natural resources management and the way we can view the Earth. So, poor natural resources management governance, degradation or pollution of resources, and of course, the inequitable sharing of resources that often drive conflict settings. Next slide, please. So, as Charles mentioned, I am the Global Partnership Manager for NASA. A few years ago, essentially, we were focused on assessing the partnerships that we have. And we recognized very clearly that we had been working with very robust relationships with academia and, of course, the space sector. But we didn't have as solid a relationship with public and private sectors. So we developed a global partnerships program, and of course I managed then the 4 partnerships that Charles mentioned: Conservation International, Google, Mercy Corps, and Microsoft. Today I'm going to be talking specifically about the work that we're doing with Mercy Corps. Next slide, please. So Mercy Corps is a humanitarian development organization, and it's been really interesting to be able to work with them, I think, on a number of perspectives, mainly because it's not typical for an entity like NASA to work with a humanitarian agency, and so there's a lot of learning going on. I think they take a very qualitative, boots on the ground approach, and of course we have very much the eyes in the sky. But what's been wonderful about the work that I'll be able to talk to you a little bit about today is the approaches that Mercy Corps has and how they complement the way that NASA works and the way that others that are working in the data and technology side of things could also be considering. Namely, that when we're working in a particular country or context, Mercy Corps is asking a series of questions like, who are they building resilience for? What are they building resilience to? or what stresses or shocks exist that may drive or greatly impact particular elements of the system. This is important when you're thinking about it from an environmental perspective, because we can also see these things. The first question, resilience for whom, is really a question of scale. Are we working with national governments, local communities, or are we working maybe with regional entities such as river basin commissions? When we're looking at the resilience of what, we're building the context of the environment that we're looking in. So what issues are we really hoping to better understand? What can we visualize in order to provide science-informed decision-making? And of course, the shocks and stresses are things like drought or floods, but can also be conflict and other types of fragility as well. Next slide, please. And so the focus of the work that I'm talking to you about today is really on the work that we're doing in Mali. What I'm talking about is intended essentially to begin in Mali, but we're hoping to work across the Sahel using similar approaches, particularly because of a lot of similar issues that are driving change in Mali you can see happening across different parts of the Sahel. So of course, the country of Mali has increasing issues related to conflict. Recently, they've had a lot of political instability, but they are also facing desertification and extensive drought, and really great demands and pressures on the water supply. And so within Mali, we're looking specifically, and what you see reflected in the larger image here is the Inner Niger Delta. Within this region, along with the desertification and drought, you see a lot of dependence specifically on the peak flows or flood events that will wash water throughout the basin, providing a lot of the water needed for agricultural practices, as well as for nomadic herders that have cattle grazing on shifting plots of land following the water and vegetation. One of the greatest issues that we're looking at right now is the development or the planned development of the Fomi and Tausa dams, which you see reflected on the map here. There are smaller dams that do exist throughout the Inner Niger Delta, but we're talking now about two large-scale hydropower dams that are intended to be developed at particular points within the Inner Niger Delta that will really change not only the flow regime, but also the sediment variability and availability, which lead to the overall health or degradation of the delta. And so I would say that what we're trying to do is essentially take a stepped approach to understanding the changes that are occurring in the delta. The first element, which I'll show and speak more on about today, are just understanding the current trends that are happening within the delta, how much land is available, how it's being used, etc. But we'll be taking a step after that to then move into understanding the drivers and the impacts of the changes that we're seeing, and eventually move toward modeled scenarios that can provide decision makers with the ability to understand what some of the challenges with the dam and changing flow regimes could have within the delta. Next slide. So some of the first things that we're looking at are related, again, we're very focused on the hydrology of the basin, or of the delta in particular. So we're looking not only at the vegetation and the land cover and land use elements that exist within the region, but also at the amount of precipitation that exists within the delta, the number of flood events, the extent and timing of the flood events, and how that impacts the changing vegetation and overall regime of the delta. Next slide. We're also looking at issues related to the socioeconomic elements, how people access markets, what it means in relation to their overall livelihoods to have some of these changes happen within the basin, and then also what the pressure of in-migration or out-migration could pose to this system, meaning that I think in the case of Foamy alone, that dam is estimated to displace around 50,000 people. These are all essentially involuntary resettlement. So understanding where these people are relocated to, what that means for additional pressures on particular portions of the delta are all important factors when understanding the health of this ecosystem. We're also looking at issues related to the fact that the dams are suggested to be built on the edge of Ramsar protected wetland sites. So I think we're not just talking about the overall ability or availability of water as a source for lives and livelihoods of the people within the delta, but what it also means for the habitats that are potentially lost as a result of the development of these dams. Next slide, please. And all of this to say, finally, is just that we're starting off with some of these building blocks of understanding the historic trends and current setting of how to visualize what's going on within the delta. But the next steps will be about linking those visualizations to drivers of impacts within the delta and then eventually to modeled scenarios. The modeled scenarios can then give a better understanding of how you can make or link certain decisions to natural resources management within the basin as a result of the science that's informing these decisions. Some of the benefit of working with Mercy Corps has been not only the methodology that they use in approaching some of these complex problems, but also they have, in every situation they work, they're often conducting a lot of qualitative surveys. All of this information can be integrated into the work that we're doing at NASA to get more localized perspectives of some of the changes that are occurring. And of course, we're working in this setting with both the national government and within local communities to ensure that some of the the science that we're developing can be used to inform specific adaptive capacities within the region so that we can not just better manage the resources, but also contribute to overall environmental peace building. Next slide. I would finally just say, if you have any additional questions that we may not be able to get to today within the workshop, please do email me. I'm happy to take questions either over email or at the end of the session. Thanks so much for your time.
Shana, thank you so much. This is a part of the world, the Inner Niger Delta, where a lot of interesting, not always good change is taking place. So really interesting to see what you guys are doing there. I'm now going to introduce Jared Bales. Jared is Executive Director of the Consortium of Universities for the Advancement of Hydrologic Science, Incorporated. Prior to this, he was the U.S. Geological Survey's Chief Scientist for Water. In this position, he was the senior executive responsible for $100 million worth of activities related to the planning and development of national hydrological research and technology transfer. Jared, the floor is yours.
Thank you. So data. I can't make bricks without clay. That's Sherlock Holmes trying to build a case brick by brick, but his point is he can't build a case without data. And my point is that water data and water data sharing can help resolve water disputes, create trust, and potentially lead to trust and more political stability. So water-related issues, in fact, are becoming a recurrent factor in local and national and regional fragility. Over the past 5 years, the World Economic Forum has identified water issues, either extreme weather events, climate change, natural disasters, water crises, human migration driven by water and food scarcity, all as major risks to the economy. but because floods and droughts and water scarcity don't respect political boundaries, managing water requires international collaboration, and so it can be used as a vehicle for cooperation and trust. Next slide. So often when states share water, states or regions or nations share waters, there's the assumption of a zero-sum outcome, right? So there's only so much. There's just winners and losers. And the key ingredient to negotiation and to get out of this zero-sum mindset is trust. Not necessarily trust in experts, but trust in processes and trust in information. And for scientific or technical information to be trusted, it generally needs to be generated collaboratively. We've heard about the Israeli-Jordan situation, and in fact, Uri Shamir, who is an Israeli negotiator on the 1994 agreement, said the joint work in the field, measuring stream flows and planning projects, remained a major confidence building measure during the years of the negotiation. The veracity and accuracy of the data provided by one party was continuously examined and often questioned, but this did not undermine the basic trust between them. And so, you know, parties can agree on shared goals and shared actions only if they're operating with a shared set of facts or data. Senator Moynihan from the US said, you know, you're entitled to your own opinion, but you're not entitled to your own set of facts. So there have been examples beyond the Jordanian Israeli data sharing initiative. In Cyprus, the island shared by Greece and Turkey, a database was built that both nations on Cyprus could share. The Western States Water Council in the US, a very water-stressed region where there's lots of competition for water, and in fact, water crosses watershed boundaries in both directions. But the Western States Water Council has developed a system in which the states involved, the parties involved, share their water use data. Next slide. So a key thing that I actually failed to mention on the last slide is that making sure that data are fair, findable, accessible, interoperable, reusable. And not only data, but the processes used to generate the data need to be fair. So, you know, data may be sitting on your machine, but if I don't know it's there, even though it's accessible, I can't find it. And you may have data, but it's collected in such a way that it's not clear to me, or I can't reuse it. Again, it's not necessarily useful to me. So nations need to have access to and a consensus on water data. Now, one of the things, of course, that's changed, and Shana addressed it, is remote sensing. So I've worked in countries in which data were not shared across departments within the same country. So the weather department would not share data with the water department, and that's using those terms loosely. But with remote sensing, then data become more accessible. One example in which another example in which I've been involved is in the Mekong, which I think we'll hear a little bit about next. But through funding from the US government, a system was built in which anyone could share data and could also share workflows. And so this system is called HydroShare, and it's used extensively in the US by the scientific community and also by other water agencies. Next slide. So the, next slide. So the US government and the State Department took this open access code, open source code, this system that was developed, and stood it up in the Mekong region. And so now the riparian basins in the Mekong have a system in which everyone can share their data and workflows, you know, in other words, how were the data created and how were they QA'd and how are they used in models and so on. All of that information can be shared. So back to the original proposition here is that water data sharing can help resolve water issues. Water data sharing creates trust, and trust can lead to improved diplomacy. So thank you.
Thank you, Jared. It's a great presentation. I now want to introduce Robert Muscat. Sorry, Bob, if I butchered your name. Bob is a development economist with extensive overseas experience. He has served with USAID, the World Bank, and UN agencies, and as a resident economic advisor to the governments of Thailand and Malaysia. He has published on many subjects, including problems of conflict in developing countries. Bob, the floor is yours.
Okay, I've unmuted. Is that working?
Yes, we hear you.
Okay. Thank you, Charles. And in a way, it's an advantage being the last speaker on the panel because I've already learned a lot in the last hour, including some things that are pertinent to what I'm going to say. I'm going to describe a few cases where large water engineering projects have been or are major factors affecting war or peace. So I'm focusing on the peace side of this conference. That's peace both within states and between states. The projects have done this by affecting what are seen as vital interests between the countries or between contending populations within a country. In short, the stakes in these water projects have been very high. Each case is complex, of course, and I can only outline the bare bones. And I don't have any slides to divert your attention. So you'll just have to put up with listening and looking at me. I'll start with a historical project, the division of the waters of the Indus River, shared by India and Pakistan. When the two countries achieved independence in 1947, it was clear that agreement on how the waters would be shared for irrigation was a critical issue. The World Bank stepped in and helped to engineer and negotiate a mutually acceptable win-win design. A potential war was successfully avoided. This was a good outcome. Unfortunately, of course, as we all know, the two countries have gone to war since, but for reasons having nothing to do with the sharing of water. My second case is especially interesting because it involves two projects within the same country, Sri Lanka, with opposite results in a context of high tensions and indeed of civil war. The Mahaweli Irrigation and Hydro Project was the largest infrastructure project in the country's history. The original design included a main canal that would bring water to a northern region which is populated mainly by the ethnic Tamil minority. When the project authority decided to drop this canal, ostensibly for technical reasons, The decision seemed to confirm the view of the Tamil militants that the government and its ethnic Sinhalese majority was intent on imposing a Sinhalese hegemony that would be hostile to the vital interests of the Tamils. The Mahaweli was not the only problem, of course, but it was of major importance. When the aid agencies, the World Bank, the US, and Canadian mainly, pressed the government to restore the Northern Canal, the government refused. The civil war that ensued lasted 26 years and cost around 100,000 lives, a tragic outcome. In a striking contrast, a smaller Sri Lanka irrigation project called the GWA was managed deliberately to ensure that both Sinhalese and Tamil farmers received the optimal water flow each group needed. The system created water user groups that brought together the Tamil and Sinhalese farmers who were working land along each channel. When Tamil militants tried to convince the Tamil farmers to stop participating in the user groups, the farmers refused to opt out. The GWA remained a zone of peace amidst the surrounding violence. This was a better outcome. Incidentally, a technical assistance team from Cornell University, financed by USAID, helped the redesign of the management system that was needed to achieve this peaceful result. My third case is ongoing, and that is the harnessing of the Great Mekong. The Mekong rises in Tibet and flows 2,700 miles through China and Myanmar, formerly Burma, and the four lower basin countries, Laos, Thailand, Cambodia, and Vietnam. And then the river empties out into the South China Sea. In the 1950s, under UN auspices, the concept of harnessing the river, including its tributaries, for the benefit of the countries of the lower basin was prepared as a development program that would, as a principal benefit, and this was specified in the initial documents, it would help cement peace between the riparian states. The plan envisaged major hydroelectric and irrigation benefits and would require a whole series of dams and a lot of money. Special machinery was set up to carry out joint planning and coordination. It was not until the wars in Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos were resolved that the program got into full swing. Meanwhile, China began its own dam building program in the upper reaches of the river, and then recently set up a separate coordination mechanism that also includes Myanmar. So the upshot is that today, many dams have been built, an enormous amount of hydroelectricity is being generated, and irrigation has expanded. Ironically, this very success is now causing serious problems that are creating new tensions in the region. The river flow has been greatly reduced. The fisheries in Cambodia, vital for that country, are threatened, and reduced silt deposit and increased seawater intrusion are degrading the large agricultural delta in Vietnam. More dams are being built. China and Laos are seen as the chief culprits. Jared mentioned the data sharing. Yes, the mechanism for data sharing was included right from the start. And China has been accused of withholding data on water releases from its upper dams as having compounded the degradation effects. And of course, the whole system has been further degraded in the last 2 years by a serious drought. The Mekong coordination machinery is not robust enough to put a brake on further construction or to influence China's decisions regarding water release from its upstream dams. To use Carol's phrase, there is no regulatory hammer in this situation, and indeed there cannot be any. At this point, a pathway to saving the river and ensuring regional harmony is not in sight. To conclude, I'll just mention one more ongoing, very troubling case. Ethiopia is building a huge dam on the Nile River. The two downstream countries, Sudan and Egypt, are extremely concerned over the lack of any standing coordinating mechanism to guide water release, especially during years marked by downstream droughts or flooding. Negotiations have gotten nowhere. Last year, the Egyptian foreign minister warned that if satisfactory management arrangements were not reached, Egypt might have to go to war to destroy the dam. War was the word that he used. What he said may be only a negotiating, a piece of negotiating rhetoric, but it also sounds like a ticking bomb. The US Secretary of State, Pompeo, last year attempted to bring the parties together and facilitate negotiations, but this US effort also failed. In all these cases, choices of alternative water engineering designs and management systems were critical to whether the projects exacerbated the conflicts or promoted peace. So the takeaways are that these seem to be the critical factors. First, the physical engineering in the successful cases developed the right options. They were also linked with social engineering, in which all the stakeholders were heard and responded to. There was also a facilitating role by outside good offices, either bilateral or under UN auspices. And those good offices were particularly effective if there was money on the table, which in large-scale dam projects, large-scale water engineering is usually the case for developing countries. So I'm especially taken with the regulatory hammer problem. Elaborate regulatory coordination and data sharing mechanisms have been set up, overlapping in fact, in the case of the Mekong, but they have no enforcement mechanism. So everything depends on the effectiveness of diplomacy.
Bob, thank you so much for that presentation. We now have, I think about 20 minutes, maybe a little less, for questions and answers. And we've been receiving many good questions from all of you. And so I had prepared some of my own, but since you guys are all very active in writing questions to us, I can thankfully take questions from the audience. There's a question for Carol, which is there a way to pay for environmental services in the Delaware watershed similar to the New York City Watershed Alliance?
Thanks for that question. You know, New York City's a different situation where they are in a filtration avoidance program with EPA and therefore expending much money on helping farmers, municipalities, et cetera, improve their water quality above their reservoirs, which is a less expensive alternative than to put filtration in on those reservoirs. There has been starts and stops on trying to come up with a water fund for the basin where water users downstream would pay into a system which would support activities upstream. There's a pilot system of that on the Brandywine River. That's one that starts in Pennsylvania and ends up in Delaware. But so far, we've not been able to figure out how to do a whole water fund for the basin. Any ideas would be gratefully received.
Got to unmute myself. Thanks, Carol. Let me look. There have been a couple of questions on data sharing, and is it realistic to expect that different riparians along a transboundary basin will actually share data with each other? I guess the questions came in for both Shana and Jared. Or maybe it's my reformulation of the question. Are we able to circumvent the problems with data secrecy with increasing data from remote sensing based sources?
Would you like to have me start first, Charles? Or?
Sure.
Okay. So I think from a NASA perspective, one of the benefits is that all of our data is freely open and available. So anyone who's using it, producing or processing it to any particular use can rely on the fact that it's open and free. The problem with secrecy is, I think, something that we're always going to, probably have to tackle because I think for a while I previously worked with the Danube Commission, and on one hand, the availability of data is really crucial and key to us getting a better understanding of the entire basin system from multiple levels of governance. But on the other hand, there's a lot of people who believe that it will be used for ill will, right? For conflict purposes even. I think that ends up having to be part of the governance mechanism that we develop when we're talking about these shared perspectives. If we're coming in together from a river basin agreement situation or something else, we all need to come to the table on figuring out what our views and shared perspectives are on doing that. And because it's my opinion personally that one of the issues that we're really starting to see more and more is not really a problem of secrecy and sharing necessarily, but that there's an overabundance of data and an overabundance of maybe data products that are being developed that aren't really developed with the real intent or relevancy needed to make science informed and really accurate decisions. So we're in a time where it's really the overabundance of data that's leading to, I think, confusion in what's right, what's wrong, how we can use certain things. And so the focus in my mind should really start shifting towards how can we build greater capacities to be able to understand the information that we have in front of us and how can we use it in a way that's productive. Those are my thoughts anyways.
That's great, Shana. Jared, what's your take on remotely sensed data? Is it a boon or is it a threat, or what's your thinking?
So more data is always better in my opinion, and so I think remotely sensed data can do a couple of things. So one example is FuseNet, the Famine Early Warning System Network. And so FuseNet is built off of remotely sensed information in regions, primarily the low latitudes, where in situ data are unavailable, or where there's a reluctance to share whatever data there are. Well, FuseNet, by building this data product off of multiple remote sensing platforms, has really been very valuable to the aid community across the world. And so this is a real application, a real case in which remotely sensed information has made a great impact. The other place where I think it's positive is that, I think there is a reluctance to share data. I mean, as I said, I've seen it in nations, departments within a given nation not want to share their data. And so one of the departments was the meteorological data. Well, if one can now get precipitation data through the various precipitation missions, then there's less need, there's less rationale for holding on to those data. And remotely sensed information opens up the world's or the region's eyes to issues. Before GRACE, the world really didn't know how depleted the aquifers were in Northwest India. But now we all know. Now we all know that that's a major issue, and it's a food security issue. So yeah, I think it's great, and from a lot of perspectives.
Great, and I love the FuseNet application, and what I love the most about it is that you have marshaled the data to answer questions: how food insecure are these places? And that will be used by people and organizations who want to prevent starvation from happening. There's a question about the Blue Nile and the problems between Egypt, Ethiopia, and Sudan. I think Egypt derives about 86% of its water from the Blue Nile and its tributaries. So I guess the question for Bob is, the Nile isn't difficult to model. There's one river that kind of arrives in Egypt from the 10 neighbors that live upstream from it. How can Egypt resolve this problem for itself? It used to claim 75% of all the water in the Blue and White Niles for itself, and it doesn't seem to make sense anymore to try to adhere to that, I guess, colonial era water right, I guess. Bob, how do you resolve a problem like the Nile?
Well, after I give my answer, I'll put my name in for the Nobel Prize.
Okay.
Egypt will eventually get all the water. As you know, Egyptian civilization is that river has been the heart, the center, the spine of Egyptian civilization for several thousand years. The problem is not that Ethiopia will divert any of that water. At least that's my understanding. Will not be diverting any of the water for irrigation in Ethiopia. The problem is the timing of the release. And what Egypt wants is a coordinating mechanism in which Egypt has a vote so that the release of the water meets Egypt's vital needs for water release, especially in years of drought when the Nile is not providing the water and resiltation and so on that Egyptian agriculture needs, and that's really vital. It's unfortunate that neither the Organization for African Unity or the UN has been asked or has offered to step in to be a neutral good offices party in the coordinating mechanism. I think that will be essential because at the moment there's no trust between the two countries. It will take several years before this actually evolves as a managerial issue, because Ethiopia has to build the dam first, and then has to allow water to accumulate while releasing, of course, a lot water to accumulate behind the dam for the dam to serve as a source of hydroelectricity. So there's time, but the Egyptian foreign minister's level of anxiety, as expressed last year, is very worrisome. But I say the solution that I see is for international good offices to be introduced, but in a systematic way, as a quasi-hammer, if you will, in the management. It's obvious that the good offices of the United States alone so far have accomplished nothing.
Thanks, Bob. And your Nobel Prize is on the way. Shana, there's an interesting question for you, or there was, and now it seems to have shifted. Okay, yeah, so bringing us back to the Mali project. There's a question about, what are the conversations around improving quality of life and economic growth while protecting water and wildlife? And I guess I'd further add to that question, whose quality of life are we looking at? There's the quality of life of the relatively poor inhabitants of the Inner Niger Delta, so farmers, fishermen, pastoralists. There's also the quality of life of richer people in Mali who are diverting a lot of the Niger River to grow cash crops and sell them on the global market. And then, of course, there's the interest of the environment. So are you privy to what the conversations are regarding an equitable distribution of water and land resources among these competing interests?
I mean, that's a good question, Charles. I think at least with the work that we're doing, it's very stakeholder driven. So we work with the local communities. As a U.S. government representative, I have to ensure that the Mali government knows that I'm doing work within their country and that they, can, openly be aware of any outcomes that occur through the Mercy Corps work. But in this regard, what ends up happening is we really do need to take a large perspective. A lot of times we can say that it's easy to model maybe the hydrology of a basin or of a particular area. But what I'm particularly focused on with this work is looking at the system, which is, it's not necessarily something that's readily done or easily done. And I think that as a result, we've brought on I've specifically brought on and developed a team of experts working across NASA that have, expertise in land cover, land use patterns, but also in the ecosystem services perspective. So we cannot just look at things that relate to the economies that are looking to be built, but rather the protection of the system in a way that reduces some of the negative impacts related to food security or to overall lives in the Delta. So I think from a governance perspective, there's I think there's some sort of acknowledgement of the work being done at the national government, but we're working at the local level. And then as far as the perspective we're taking, it's quite broad. Again, because in order to understand the health of an ecosystem, it's not just about understanding how much water is there. The outputs of the work that we're doing will then be given to the stakeholders that we're working with. So it's more about, I guess if you're following this, I know it's rather complex, but the ideas that we develop things with the stakeholders in mind. It's in order to move the work forward between Mercy Corps and the local communities, and not us as a US government agency trying to move those types of activities forward. We're just the science element of the information. And my goal here is really to be as holistic in the approach as humanly possible. Hopefully that answers it, but it's a lot of moving parts, a lot of levels of governance, and is somewhat confusing even for me sometimes.
I'm so glad you're working in this region, because Mali is at a history where it needs a lot of outside help to look at these types of knotty issues. I'm being told that I might have one more question. And so I have a question for Carol. And correct me if I'm wrong, but I thought you mentioned that the Delaware River Basin Commission's experience has been used to help other basins, maybe in the United States, maybe outside of the United States, to set up their own river basin management or improve their river basin management. Is that true? And if so, could you tell us about one that sticks in your mind?
Sure. I just say two. One, while I was at the Basin Commission, I was called down to the Atlanta issue, the Georgia, Alabama, Florida water problems. And they had tried for quite a while to create a river basin commission. They had, tried a number of times. And one of the problems is people look at setting an allocation as a line in the sand that has to stay forever. And I think the value of a basin commission is to be there so that as conditions change, whether they be scientific, political, whichever, you can massage it a little bit. And that's what's happened with the negotiations with New York City and the down basin states, that the line that was drawn by the Supreme Court in the 1960s, 50s, just wasn't relevant when we got into other weather conditions. And so there's an ability to massage that a little. And I think down south, they thought if they set, certain releases from the reservoirs, who got the water in the Flint, et cetera, it would last forever, and it just can't act that way. I was also involved with the Woodrow Wilson Institute on an effort with China. There were 3 from the US, 3 from China, 3 from Japan, to really work with China to develop more river basin assessment. And it was just eye-opening. And I think they have used some of that. When I first went over, they have river basin commissions, but it's rather a expansion of what we would call the Army Corps of Engineers. They're like satellite offices. It's not really engaging the provincial governments or people. I think that has come a ways, and there is more local involvement. But I think it's a value in a number of places.
Fantastic. Well, there are a lot of other good questions, but I have to cut it off here. Maybe we can address the questions that have gone unanswered via email or some other way. So right now, there's a little button down on the bottom of your whatever we're called Zoom meeting that has reactions. And so you can either clap or give a thumb up. And so I want to give either a clap or a thumb up to all these speakers. Thank you so much for sharing your experiences in this area of water and peace.
I also clap and give thumbs up. Thank you to all of our speakers and to Charles for moderating and facilitating such a robust discussion. Oh, how I wish we were gathering for lunch all together to continue all these discussions. Instead, we will take about a 12-minute break, 10-minute break, and we will reconvene with another fabulous group of speakers at 12 noon sharp. For other time zones, that's in about 10 minutes. So thank you again for our speakers, and we'll be back soon. Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I hope you were able to stretch your legs just a little bit and are still reeling with the thoughts from the first panel that we were on. Just to remind you that we are recording this session and everything will be available in the next couple of days. I am thrilled to introduce to you Allison Lassiter, who is the moderator for our second panel. Allison is joining us straight off of 3 hours of teaching, but at least the commute wasn't bad today. So Allison's work focuses on long-term planning of water availability in response to climate change and sea level rise, and I will let her introduce the next panel. Thank you, Allison.
Thanks, Mira. I am so happy to be here today. Can everyone hear me okay? I can't see anyone. So
we can hear you and we can see you.
Great, perfect. So it's such an honor to be here and such an important topic and really fascinating time to be able to engage with a lot of these questions. I mean, despite all of the global shifts that have been happening, the problems and sort of challenges of water persist and are in fact intensifying. So I feel really privileged to be able to continue to work on these problems. One of the things that, so our panel today, panel 2, is working on water, peace, and development, case studies highlighting importance of water security, including access to wash and ecosystem integrity, and promoting sustainable development and building peaceful responses to water stress.
Hi guys, can you hear me?
We can. So the thing that's really fantastic about this panel is that while we're looking at case studies, there's some common themes too. And all of these talks that you're about to hear will deal with it really specifically with how different communities interact with their water resources. And so we will see we're going to start with, here we go, Corinne Tangchakol, who is so kindly was able at the last minute to step in for Dr. Franco Montalto, who had to bow out today. But they work together, Corinne is the sustainability manager for the Sustainable Water Resource Engineering Lab at Drexel University. She comes from a really interdisciplinary background, including geography, urban planning. She works with green infrastructure and deals a lot with community engagement and environmental activism. So she's going to be taking us through, they work in projects all over the globe, but specifically going to be taking us through some projects in the US and looking at how communities are interacting with their infrastructure. The next, we're going to hear from Dr. Marissa Ensor, who is a gender and youth specialist with a background in human dimensions of disasters, environmental change, conflict, development, and security. She has a background in political ecology and human rights law, and her work primarily engages with sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America. She's currently based at Georgetown University's Justice and Peace program. And then, so her work is looking a lot at women and children and their relationship with water. And then lastly, we'll talk to Dr. Scott Moore, who is a political scientist who focuses on water politics and policy. His expertise is primarily in China and South Asia. He's a senior fellow at the Penn Water Center and is also the director of China programs at the Office of the Provost at the University of Pennsylvania. He has a recent book called Subnational Hydropolitics, Conflict, Cooperation, and Institution Building. So again, a look at communities, but from a slightly different angle, like a coarser, more sort of institutional angle. So we're going to see kind of 3 different scales of communities and how these communities interact with their water supplies. So I'm really excited to start us off with Corinne. Why don't you take it away?
Thank you, Allison. So my name is Corinne, and as Allison mentioned, I manage the Sustainable Water Resource Engineering Lab. I'm a last minute sub-in today for our director of the lab, Dr. Franco Montalto. So I apologize I don't have any slides to share, but I can tell you about some of the things that we've been working on. I realize this is also a very global conversation that we've been having all day, and a lot of our work is actually very local. And I'll talk a little, well, I'll show you a little video about stuff that we're doing in Camden. But typically our work has been mostly in the Philadelphia region. And Dr. Montalto, as you may have seen in his bio, he spent decades performing research on green stormwater infrastructure to demonstrate how these nature-based approaches can manage urban runoff while also promoting urban sustainability and resilience. I think our lab is fairly unique for an engineering research lab because community engagement is very core to our research. In many of Dr. Franco Montalto's past projects, there has been engagement through hiring residents as civic scientists to be part of the research project. And in this project in Camden, New Jersey, Dr. Montalto worked with the Power Corps to identify, to work with communities to identify the areas where they would like to implement green infrastructure. So we have a little video about that. I'm going to ask Mira to play that video, and I hope y'all can hear it okay. Go ahead, Mira.
I say we beating our odds every day, and the reason why I say that is because as soon as you hear Camden, New Jersey on the news or somewhere, they talking about killing, shooting. If you actually come out here and spend like a day, a week, you'll see like everybody has the same problems, like the same issues, the same questions.
A big piece is increasing community engagement. So getting those people that's outside the box to come inside the box and just share in the goodness of Camden like everybody else.
The biggest weakness for me is definitely the drama and the negativity, such as like crime and stuff like that.
Like some people, they know they can do better, but they don't choose to do better because where we live. But I feel like that shouldn't stop them.
Job opportunities, like they're lacking because there's a lot of, if you don't know this person, you don't know that person, you can't get a job.
And the flooding, and like around the corner from our house is like when it rains, like a big flood. Then the gutters be full with trash and stuff, so the water can't go down in there, you know. It's be a swimming pool. And then my house, we had to get our basement all fixed and stuff, so it gets bad out here. I appreciate the parks because that's where like everybody come together as one.
In the summertime, when the weather gets warmer, they tend to like do barbecues and things inside the park that brings the community together. Camden is a small city, so everybody knows everybody.
If you have a strong foundation of family, you can become anything. If you have that behind you, support goes a long way, and it starts from within your home and your household.
There's so much untapped potential. Like they're just now trying to tap into the potential that Camden could possibly be.
People I work with Power Corp, they care about Camden. So like if I would have never found out about none of this, I would think nobody cares about it or anything. But when I actually did this program, it's like there's people out here that actually care about my city. Yeah. And that makes me happy.
There's good things in the city. It just need light.
Okay, thanks, Mira, for playing that video. So that's just a snippet of the voices that we hear as we're working in these different communities. And so I started working in Dr. Montalto's lab just over a year ago, and I actually started after that project had happened, so I wasn't involved in that one. And actually, I've now been working remotely for almost half of the time I've been part of this lab, which has had its own challenges. But this summer in particular, the wave of police killings of innocent Black people has made me really stop and think about what is our role as a research lab. I think it's really convenient for us as a mostly white lab working in mostly Black communities to think that, you know, we're doing good work, we're working on bringing these nature-based solutions to vulnerable communities. We're working on mitigating climate change impacts that are impacting low-income communities of color. We're building resilient communities. But I've been asking myself, are we doing things for the community, or is it with the community? Are we engaging the community, and can we instead be empowering the community, and how exactly do we do that? And something that really inspired this thinking for me was a quote from Cassandra Extavar, a Black biologist at Harvard, who said, "Every time one of us is rejected, beat down, dismissed, ridiculed, or murdered, I question why I'm still in academia. I love science, but justice is more important." This quote was in a New York Times climate newsletter, which then went on to say that research has shown that green STEM fields, the science, technology, and math disciplines that span climate, conservation, environmental, earth, and atmospheric sciences are among the least diverse in science. That lack of diversity sits uneasily with findings by numerous studies that people of color are more likely to live in places that suffer from pollution and are more at risk of developing associated health problems like asthma or heart disease. So for me, being overwhelmed by the racial disparities in this country, which are being multiplied by the impacts of climate change and COVID-19, encouraging diversity in STEM feels like the least that I could do. So I've been asking how I can use my privilege and my power as a manager of an engineering research lab to address some of these disparities. So over the summer, I was doing a lot of reading, a lot of listening, and asking myself a lot of questions to figure that out. I've been having meetings with my colleagues in our lab to discuss these questions, and I'm still figuring a lot of things out. But my first step in ensuring that we are my first step is ensuring that we are engaging community in the first stages of any project that we approach. Before we even submit a proposal and seek funding, I want to make sure that the questions we're asking throughout the research project are not just for the sake of academic prestige, but are actually useful for and inspired by the people that live in those communities. I would like us to be co-creators of these research outputs and for community members or organizations to be co-investigators with us. I'm learning there are many challenges to that. This makes things a lot slower, and the funding sources we typically apply for aren't conducive to that type of research partnership. But it's something I'd really like to improve upon for our lab, because I keep asking myself, like, what is the point of this research? Who is this research for? Because it's not for me. It's not to improve the community that I live in. It's for the communities that we're working in, and it should be done in partnership with those communities. So I'll leave it there, and looking forward to any questions that come in the Q&A. And thank you again for having our lab.
Thank you so much, Corinne. So I think we will take questions at the end all together. And for now, we will move on and we will talk with Dr. Marissa Ensor.
All right. Well, thank you, Alison, for that introduction. I am thrilled to be in a conversation with my fellow panelists and with all of you in the audience, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome. Now, I've been given 10 minutes to discuss some elements, some aspect of the relationship between water and conflict, or water and peace, an extremely broad and urgent topic indeed. And since, as Alison mentioned, I am trained as an environmental anthropologist in political ecology, among other things, I am going to focus on human environmental relations. I will only have time to briefly mention one illustrative case study, and I will do so from a gender perspective. Okay, so I have prepared a few slides that I would like to share with you if technology cooperates. So if the slides are ready, let's go ahead.
Just a quick, do you want us to share them?
I can share my own if that's easier. All right, give me a second then. All right, are you seeing my title slide?
Yes.
Perfect, all right. So that is the title of my presentation. Now, you may be familiar with this type of graphic showing water conflict pathways in some well-known hotspots across the globe. What is critical to remember is that the relationship between the environment and conflict is never linear, but mediated by many other factors. Environmental factors, political institutions, economic conditions, and sociocultural values and perceptions affect water security, or lack thereof, and frame conflict risk. This type of broad stroke analysis, like the one shown in the graphic, is not sufficiently granular to help us understand the impact of these events and processes on the people on the ground. People's positionality, that is their position in society, will affect their specific vulnerability to water insecurity and the possibility of conflict as a result. This is how the UN, for example, defines water security, recognizing the link between environmental conditions on the one hand and political stability on the other. Still, the unit of analysis, in this case the populations, I would argue remains too broad. Similarly, this USAID definition acknowledges the interrelations between environmental and political factors, or what I would call the political ecology of water security, without alluding to the unit of analysis, whose adaptive capacity, whose access to and use of water. Which brings me to the main argument I want to advance in this presentation, which is that examining how gender differentiated vulnerabilities and resilience how they interact is critical to understanding the relationship between water, conflict, and peace. Now, I've titled my presentation, Women Building Bridges Over Troubled Waters. Equating gender with only women is problematic on many levels, and we can discuss why I've done that at more length during the Q&A. Gender is a relational variable, but in this case, in the case of water, there is some justification for focusing specifically on women, on how women are affected. Now, the ethnographic record confirms that globally, women and girls are responsible for water collection in 8 out of 10 households where water is off premises. There is, however, a significant degree of regional variation. This variation is not just regional, but also in terms of rural versus urban contexts, with rural Africa showing the most pronounced disparities, with girls under 15 also disproportionately shouldering the burden of water collection. And why am I calling it a burden? As a result of the time spent finding and carrying water, sometimes hours each day, women and girls have less time to improve their lives through education, work, or rest and leisure. It is, however, important not to limit the discussion of water and gender to the home sphere or domestic sphere. Reducing time burdens associated with water collection shouldn't be the only goal. Efforts should be directed at fostering women's inclusion in every aspect of water management and water governance as integral components of water security. We must also remember that water is not just a physical resource, but also a geographical space that can facilitate or hinder human mobility and transportation and serve as either a boundary or a bridge between territories and communities. And I want to illustrate these points with examples from a particular case study. I'm not sure whether you can see the small writing on that graphic up here. Okay. This graphic is disaggregating primary responsibility for water collection by gender and age. South Sudan tops the list of world countries where women and girls are primarily responsible. When South Sudan is mentioned, the first thought that comes to most people's minds is the conflict. Indeed, since 1955, that is a year before the end of the Anglo-Egyptian condominium that resulted in the independence of what at the time was the Sudan, South Sudan has witnessed nothing but a succession of periods of extremely violent conflict punctuated by negative peace, during which communal violence has remained unabated. The so-called revitalized peace agreement, I'm down here now, signed in 2018. It was September 2019, so almost exactly 2 years, well, it put an official end to the political violence, at least on paper, but not to the communal violence or to the rampant sexual and gender-based violence against women and children, primarily. Often less discussed is the fact that according to the Climate Change Vulnerability Index, South Sudan is among the 5 most vulnerable countries in the world, alongside the Democratic Republic of Congo, Central African Republic, Haiti, and Liberia. The country is among the most rapidly warming locations on the globe, with temperatures increasing as much as 0.0 degrees per decade over the past 30 years, 2.5 times faster than the global average. Environmental conditions are becoming increasingly arid, with intensified and prolonged periods of drought punctuated by erratic and brief but torrential rains. And it is this variability and the unpredictability of increasingly extreme weather patterns that is causing most of the problems. Okay, so I took those photographs in March of last year. Okay? The conditions were severe drought and water scarcity. Well, I was supposed to be in South Sudan right now, but COVID-19 happened, and instead I'm having to rely on the work of the organizations with whom I normally work with when I'm there, primarily AMA, Assistance Mission for Africa. My colleagues from AMA are the ones who sent me these photographs, and these are from 2 weeks ago. Severe flooding. And this is a map from OCHA, the Organization for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs of the UN. This is as of September the 3rd. Notice the levels of displacement, particularly around the Nile. Okay, so far there have been 600,000 people newly displaced, in addition to the ones that remain displaced from the previous conditions. Approximately 2.2 million refugees and 1.6 million IDPs, internally displaced people, as a from a combination of both conflict and environmental conditions, and a combination thereof. Okay. Again, some photographs from 2 weeks ago sent to me by my colleagues at Assistance Mission for Africa. And this is, I mean, it's not even an IDP camp or a protection of civilians camp. It's just people who have had fled together, looking for higher ground. But this part of the country, most of the country is quite flat. So there's really not hills that they can move up to. Notice that the majority of them are women and children and some older men. And that is because these pastoralist groups practice a form of transhuman pastoralism, whereby the women and children tend to remain more or less sedentary, practicing some form of maybe horticulture in the communities, and the younger men and boys are in the cattle camps, and they move around. And so when the communities are displaced, it is primarily the women and children that do. And of course, women are the ones responsible for feeding the children. In spite of these conditions, they have remained and increasingly active in, let's say, the political sphere. I took this photograph in the middle in September of 2018. That was during the Peace Conference of Yerol. And remember, that was the time when the peace agreement was signed. And it was the first time that women were allowed to participate. And I was fortunate enough to be invited as a representative of the international community to witness the participation of women. And that was also told to facilitate their participation. There was a women's only pre-conference just for the women. They certainly didn't need my guidance. They knew exactly what their situation was. and what they wanted to request and what they could contribute and bring to the table. So as I'm saying here, South Sudanese women's voices are loud and clear. They need to not just be heard in a tokenistic manner, but actually, also acted upon. These two other photographs are, again, from 2 weeks ago, from the areas where they have taken refuge from the flooding. And among the topics being discussed, not surprisingly, water is high on the list of priorities, in part because of the changing environmental conditions, and because, as I said, it is women's and girls' primary responsibility to procure water. And that during these situations of flooding, access to drinking water is actually limited. So why are their voices heard but not really acted upon? Well, here are some constraining factors: lack of access to funding and resources, harmful gender norms and practices, insecurity and sexual harassment, and unresolved divergent interests, because we need to remember that women don't constitute a monolithic group just because they are women, and coming from different ethnic groups, coming from different kinds of contexts, they have different priorities. So gender is only one factor among many variables. And I suspect I'm running out of time. So what happens when women's roles in water governance are ignored? Well, gender differentiated stakes and interests are overlooked. Gender differentiated costs, impacts and benefits are overlooked. Results are less equitable. Existing patterns of gender discrimination may be exacerbated, and there is less buy-in to the resulting agreement. Here's another photograph also from the Peace Conference in South Sudan. And there we have a Nuer woman and a Dinka woman. If you know anything about South Sudan, those are the two primary ethnic groups, and the main two groups participating in the conflict. And so here they are in a gesture of unity. They also engage in that position during marriages. It means unity. So in many respects, women are driving not just the negotiations are relative to water governance at the community at a very localized level, but also they are very much engaged in peace building. Yeah. Quickly, I have a graphic that I will discuss during the Q&A because I don't have time right now, but comparing the conventional water governance regime with what I would propose is a more sustainable water governance regime. And the main point is here. Traditional approaches are centralized, hierarchical, more technocratic. I would propose a more polycentric, horizontal, and hybrid multi-level approach in which the various levels of governance are recognized and the cooperation between them are facilitated. And to conclude, I would like to offer some recommendations that we can explore in more detail during Q&A. So identify and support women-led community-based management and broader organizations. That is the level at which they are more engaged. But it's also important to promote cooperation between these informal and more formal water governance institutions and arrangements. And also important to amplify the voices and support the efforts of women change agents. And finally, a crucial requirement in this field, and I would argue in any field involving human beings, it is essential to collect, analyze, and factor in gender disaggregated data at all levels. All right, so that is what I wanted to share with you as far as the presentation goes. Let me come back to the screen so I can participate in the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Marissa. And thank you for those of you who have submitted questions. I think maybe we've just had one or something so far, but please keep the questions rolling in the chat and we'll get back to them at the end of Scott's talk. So next up, we have Dr. Scott Moore, and we'll be hearing about water and conflict. the opposite of community building. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Allison. And thanks to Mira, to GWA, to the organizing team for bringing us together. Among the many things I've learned just as part of not only the panels and everything, but also just the process of seeing this event come together is about the Peace Engineering program at Drexel. I have to admit, before we started talking about this event, I wasn't aware of it. And I think it's such a cool example of innovative thinking around how you kind of merge technical expertise, values, and trying to bring in things like stakeholder consensus, all incredibly important parts of the water puzzle, as Marissa's presentation demonstrated, and as Corinne's did as well. So as Corinne kind of gave us a nice illustration of how water issues intersect with social justice, with community level activism, Marissa gave us a very nice example of how instability, water, governance, gender all intersect, especially in the case of South Sudan. I'm going to talk a little bit about the kind of specific relationship between water and conflict. And I think it's really actually a much more hopeful picture and story than a lot of the kind of popular discourse might lead us to believe. And so specifically, I'm going to try to argue against three myths that I think we often hear about water and conflict. And these are lessons, I guess, that I came to through working on my book, Subnational Hydropolitics. So next slide, please. Oh, sorry. Actually, do I have the ability to?
Just bear with us 1 second.
We're just gonna
Sure, no problem.
back in just a second.
Okay, great, perfect. So the first of those, I think, is simply the thing that you often kind of hear, that some version of like water is for fighting for, or the idea that water is somehow kind of uniquely conducive to conflict. Maybe even that it's that sharing water kind of almost inevitably leads to conflict. Sometimes we hear predictions like the one probably most commonly used, that the wars of the future will be fought not over oil, but over water, kind of variations of that theme. And yet I really don't think that's borne out by the empirical record. Admittedly, one of the difficult things about working in this area is sort of how you define conflict over water. And Marissa's presentation, I think, gave us some sense of the complexities of how both you kind of identify conflict, and then the pathways which lead from different aspects of water and water use to potentially a conflict. But one of the best attempts that I'm aware of to do this was a group that published about a decade ago and coded about 6,500 water-related events. So it was essentially, things like intergovernmental meetings or conferences, or occasionally demonstrations and things like that that had something to do with water. And of those 6,500 events, fewer than 30, 27 to be exact, involved any type of violence whatsoever. 0 involved any kind of organized interstate warfare or violence. And yet over roughly the same time period, we had about 240 interstate water agreements that were concluded. So I think, this isn't the be all and end all in terms of data sets, but I think what it does show is that we can at least be very kind of skeptical of the argument that the simple kind of act or fact of sharing water resources somehow automatically or inevitably leads us to be predisposed towards conflict. And indeed, the opposite is probably true, that cooperation over water is far more common than conflict. Next slide, please. The second thing that I think, and this was really kind of the core of what I was interested in this book, is the idea that when we think about water and conflict, we're primarily concerned with the threat or the prospect of interstate warfare. It is true, it's often pointed out in those types of arguments that virtually all major river basins are shared between multiple countries, which is certainly true. But one thing that kind of follows as a corollary from that is that virtually all major water bodies are shared between multiple subnational jurisdictions. One thing that this map shows is that there are really only two river basins of any significance, which are in fact contained within single subnational jurisdictions. Those are the two that are illustrated at the upper left-hand portion of the slide there, the Kuskokwim and the Skeena River in North America. And yet, if we kind of just take an anecdotal tour around the world, virtually every large country plays host to at least one significant example of a long-running dispute of some kind over at the subnational level over water resources. So in the US, perhaps the best known is the Colorado dispute, but there are many others. Carol, I think, mentioned the ACF dispute briefly earlier, the Murray-Darling in Australia. Virtually all of India's major river basins are host to these kind of long-running disputes between subnational jurisdictions or units, often states or provinces. So I think the second kind of thing that's important to keep in mind about conflict over water is that when it does occur, it's more likely to be at the subnational level than at the international or interstate level. Next slide, please. And this is just a quote to kind of illustrate this this point. Sorry, I forgot that that was embedded there, which is from a famous article that Aaron Wolf, who's many of you may know, is kind of one of the deans of kind of the study of water and conflict. His conclusion in trying to look at some of these subnational disputes is that while we don't have any real incontrovertible examples of kind of water wars, what we do seem to be finding is that there's some inverse relationship between scale and intensity of conflict. So again, sort of trying to make the point that where the risk of water conflict is high, it's more likely to pertain to subnational than international scales or levels. Next slide, please. The third thing that you often hear that I think is important to contest and to be a little skeptical of is the idea that it's water scarcity that is the primary driver or thing that's likely to lead to conflict. And I just wanted to sort of make that point through a brief allusion to the Colorado River Basin dispute, which really over the course of about 80 years transformed from a really intractable legal and political dispute between both the Colorado Basin states in the US as well as between the US and Mexico into really, I think, what's one of the more promising examples globally of cooperation between countries, between states, and between stakeholders. So the picture on the left there is from 1934. This is a sort of infamous incident in which the governor of Arizona at the time actually declared martial law and mobilized the National Guard, including requisitioning some old ferry boats and placing them in the Colorado River with armed soldiers there on the boats to prevent construction of a dam that had been authorized by Congress, the Parker Dam, which it was feared by Arizona would allow California to divert an outsized portion of Colorado River water and secure the rights to use that in perpetuity because of the complicated water rights regime in the basin. So a pretty pure example, I think, really of kind of conflict at the subnational level over water. And yet if you fast forward 80 years to 2014, over on the right-hand side of the slide, you'll get to something called Minute 319, which is an amendment to a 1944 agreement between the US and Mexico. Still stands as one of the more stable examples of international watercourse cooperation. But what Minute 319 did is amend that agreement to effectively provide for ecological flows into the lower Colorado, something that hadn't existed for several decades prior to around that 2014 timeframe. And this agreement was supported not just by the US and Mexican governments, but also by the riparian states, really an amazing example of cooperation. And that was something that really came about because after the early 1980s, you had the progressive influence of non-governmental organizations in Colorado Basin governance, both at the state and US federal levels. And yet all of this occurred despite rapidly increasing scarcity in the basin after the 1970s, partly due to what we now think are long-term climatic shifts, but also just due to rapid development and growing water demand. So there's nothing, I think, automatic about the relationship between scarcity and conflict. And indeed, I would suggest, I think Marissa alluded to this a little bit, I would suggest that flooding and overabundance of water is just as much a concern when it comes to sort of water conflict and instability as scarcity, probably even more so. I'm actually gonna just go ahead and stop there with kind of the benefit of putting forward those kind of three aspects of water and conflict that I think are important to keep in mind, and just with the closing observation that I think it should make us a little bit more hopeful about the way that water can be used for positive purposes, for peace building, instead of merely conflict. And yet, it's certainly not a problem or a risk that we can entirely ignore. Having ended with the Colorado case study example, I will hasten to add that just in the last 2 weeks, there has been some popular kind of discontent in Mexico over the terms of the U.S.-Mexico treaty and protests against the amount of water that Mexico is obligated to send back actually into the United States. One person was unfortunately killed in those protests. So it's not a risk that we can ignore, but I think it should give us hope that water can just as easily or just as fruitfully be a cause for cooperation and peace building as for conflict. Thank you.
Thank you, Scott. Thanks to all the presenters today. This is such an interesting juxtaposition of talks. So I want to start with a question that I have for the group, and then I'll start to bring in some of the other questions that came into the chat. So this is directed to all of you, and so let's go through each of you and get a response afterwards. So there's this really interesting, I guess you could say, sort of spatial dynamic that seems to be happening. So we see evidence of, well, Scott brings up that we see evidence that at the national level, there tends to be cooperation over water more than there is conflict over water. At the subnational level, you see some more emerging conflict than you would at the national level, though there is plenty of instances of cooperation. Then we see from Marissa's talk that actually community building, or like through women, you're actually figuring out how to cooperate over water resources and build community. And then Corinne similarly talks about community building through water resource management. So there's this sort of like sense of cooperation, and then maybe a little bit of conflict, and then maybe some way to ameliorate that conflict by intensive community work. So I'm wondering, this work that Marissa has done and Corinne has done is, I mean, that is high touch work. There's a lot of active time building community in these groups. So if we're thinking about if we're thinking about scaling that work, if we're thinking about all of the places that might have some sort of subnational conflicts over water, what are tools that we can think of that work outside of that study region that you were in? How can we expand the framework a little bit? Are there ways of dealing with this subnational conflict that Scott brings up in a way that's like not just sort of, you know, years of work with one little group and years of work with one other little group? I don't know if anyone wants to start with that.
I can start to try to answer that, because I actually was looking at a question in the chat about participatory planning methods, and I think that this might also answer that question.
Sounds great.
So we've been working, and I didn't speak about this in the presentation specifically, but one of the projects that we've been working on is a flood model for Eastwick in Southwest Philadelphia. If any folks are familiar with Eastwick, it's been battered by floods multiple times. It's a failed urban renewable community that has had issues of trust with the government for very valid reasons. There's also a toxic landfill in that community. So it is very much an environmental justice community, and they've been studied and modeled for decades, and they're still experiencing flooding, as we saw just this last summer with Hurricane Isaias. So, you know, we're kind of doing a typical engineering thing of modeling flooding in the community, but we've been thinking about what does that model mean, and how can that be useful for the community? And we've been thinking about how to make the message known for people up watershed from Eastwick, what's happening in this community, because while Eastwick itself is a low-lying environmental justice community, the watershed that contributes to it is like a mostly suburban, it's probably like a well-meaning suburban type of community that has been developing over the years. And so we've been thinking about how to kind of bridge these communities and create a dialogue between the downstream and upstream communities, similar to what the Delaware River Watershed Initiative has been working on. And one of our approaches to this, it might not, I don't know how this will scale quite yet, but one of the approaches that we've been thinking about doing is Drexel offers these side-by-side classes. They're typically a side-by-side group, Drexel students with people from the community that is like either being studied or is part of, I think a typical example are incarcerated individuals studying the law side by side with Drexel law students. That's the common way this class is kind of conceived. We've been thinking about doing a side-by-side class with people that live in Eastwick, people maybe municipal governments upstream, and Drexel students in like a hydrology class to learn about how this flooding that's starting upstream is impacting the communities of Eastwick, and then co-create some green infrastructure solutions that can be implemented upstream. So it would be like maybe like a benign way of reconciliation for the folks upstream that might not know how they're impacting downstream, and it be in a productive way, I would hope. You know, we're not trying to blame the upstream community, but we do want to be able to co-create solutions that will help downstream. So that's one approach that we're thinking about.
It's very interesting.
All right, I think I was next.
Yeah,
Thank you, Alison, for that question. I think it's an extremely important question. You've put your finger on a crucial issue, the matter of scale. And I think that questions of scale need to be considered at multiple levels. Now, in the example that I used to illustrate my points, I mentioned how South Sudanese women are becoming increasingly active, and they have always been active in all kinds of peace building and environmentally related matters, including water governance, at a very local community level. And in other countries where I've worked, it is not uncommon for people who work at this level to have a hard time scaling up their contributions. Now, being on the ground, these more grassroots kinds of approaches are in a much better position to identify how the policies that are being made at a higher level are actually impacting the people on the ground. And so one of the things that I would propose, and is really not earth-shattering news, is strengthening the cooperation on the vertical line between, community, local, national, regional, and so forth. But scale also operates on the horizontal, at the horizontal level. The structures where women tend to be more effective in their negotiations tend to be women-led or women-only, and sometimes they're, preaching to the convert and operating in this echo chamber, in which, in a way in which the main decisions are made by organizational bodies dominated by men, and the women make their contribution that ends up being kind of like a shadow contribution that may or may not be taken into consideration. And the same thing happens in societies that are structured according to ethnic differences. Those belonging to this, subordinated groups may be very well organized among themselves and have a hard time extrapolating their conclusions, their recommendations to the dominant groups. And so this cooperation needs to be scaled up and down vertically as well as horizontally between different groups. And then the final point is the timeline. Conflicts throughout the world, the nature of conflict is changing throughout the world, and we are seeing situations that tend to be much more protracted and either cyclical or recurrent. And so the relationship between the various stakeholders participating in the conflict or during periods of relative peace And the relationship between more legal, political, and cultural factors and environmental factors is also going to change over time. And so the situation is becoming increasingly complex, and that requires a much more agile approach that would recognize the interconnections between all these various factors, scaled up and down vertically, horizontally, and across time. And only when we do pay attention to these variables are we going to promote solutions that are going to be effective on the short term, but also sustainable. And that what I'm suggesting is not what we're accustomed to doing, those who are more accustomed to high-level kinds of negotiations. And so, yeah, it is, I think the situation is more complex than the way that is being treated for the most part.
I would just maybe quickly add that I think good water governance, decision-making and institutions, particularly if you're thinking about it from sort of a water user conflict prevention standpoint, have to manage a very difficult balancing act. They have to be representative without becoming political. That may be true of other issue areas as well, but I think particularly of water, because, this is kind of really the thrust of things that I found in the book and try to explore in that, is that water is very susceptible to political manipulation across countries. For a couple of reasons. One, it's, people just have a very, I think, primal emotional relationship with water that's a little different to most other resources, maybe with the exception of land or territory. And then also its sheer importance to every economic sector and economic activity really makes it pretty potent in terms of something that can really mobilize people, get people fired up, if you want to think of it that way. And so you often see, particularly in developing countries, but not exclusively. I mean, you've seen it in California, actually under the Trump administration. There are these attempts to kind of exploit political, social divisions using water as kind of a wedge. And it happens to be a very potent wedge, perhaps the most potent, again, maybe alongside land or territory than any other resource, natural resource. And so for that reason, you really have to, I think, be careful about designing governance institutions to try to avoid overt or deliberate politicization, while also being representative of the key water users. Again, that's a difficult kind of line to tread, and that's, I think, partly why we see relatively few successful water governance institutions around the world. I would just add that probably the best kind of model that I came across in my research is the structure that supports the French water agencies. Some of you may be familiar with this approach because it's now been kind of institutionalized as part of the EU Water Framework Directive. But basically, France, starting in the 1960s, divided the country up into basins and then created governance institutions around them. Over time, they've become kind of codified with a certain number of seats reserved for agricultural, industrial, water user groups, in addition to government representatives. And the key thing, I think, about those institutions are, number one, the representative structure, but also that the fact that they're paired with technical advisory committee. So you sort of have this really integrated decision-making and kind of consensus building function alongside a technical and scientific assessment capacity. The DRBC is not a bad example of that integration either, by the way, but I think the French Water Agency model is maybe the most promising single one that I've come across.
Thanks, Scott. You bring up this really interesting point where there's sort of a representative governance structures, but then Marissa and Corinne talk more about strategic coalition building. So they almost have to be complementary movements, but it sounds like there's a lot of promise there. So I think from this panel today, we've heard a lot of opportunities to build peace around water, and also thought about how there is maybe a narrative around conflict of water, but in reality, there's more opportunity for coalition building than there is actually conflict. We only have a few minutes left, and so I wanted to take some of the questions from the group before we close out. And in particular, there was one. What suggestions would each of you make? This was initially directed to Corinne, but I think we'll open up to everyone. What suggestions would you make for current and recent graduates to work on to promote sustainability and climate change resiliency in water resource management?
Yes, thanks for that question. I saw that question earlier, and I was reflecting on it quite a bit, and I realized, so I'm not an engineer graduate. I was actually in geography and environmental studies, so my career path is maybe a little bit different than what you would expect if you were graduating in engineering. But I noticed when I graduated in geography and environmental studies that people would tell me like, oh, you should get a job with an oil company, that they are looking for environmental people to find like where they should be drilling for oil. And I was like, what? That's exactly like the opposite of what I was studying to do. And I think about that a lot because I was taught and I was really interested in being more climate and environmentally conscious, but that's not typically the match that you'll find with the career path where you can make a comfortable living. And for me, I had to kind of create my own path to get to where I was. It wasn't laid out for me. And so I would suggest, no matter what job you kind of end up in, it's up to you to find ways to weave climate change or social justice or whatever matters to you into your career path. Because you might end up working for a firm that doesn't do something that you believe in, but you have to do what your client asks you to do if you end up in like an engineering firm. But you can take the initiative to research and encourage a shift in thinking towards something that's a little bit more climate conscious or more socially conscious. And that it's not going to be right in front of you. You kind of have to do the work yourself to get there. At least for me, I know a lot of the folks on this panel are like, you might have had different experiences, but I've just found that the path towards climate resiliency is not right in front of you. You have to find it, and you have to work for it, and you have to advocate for it. So I would encourage you to not be complacent in the jobs that you find, and keep pushing for more. So that's what I would say.
All right. Well, my PhD is in anthropology, and all of my previous degrees are also in various social sciences. And then my law degree is in international human rights law. So I know exactly nothing whatsoever about engineering. I don't know that I can offer any meaningful suggestions as to how to build a career in that field. But if the objective here is to find solutions that are effective and sustainable and that benefit the people on the ground, regardless of which perspective, which discipline you're approaching it for, my only advice would be know your subject and don't take for granted that because you have the degree and the people on the ground may not, you know better what the solution needs to be, because they are the ones who are experiencing these processes and events. So listen to the people on the ground and try to find ways to incorporate that knowledge into the perspectives and approaches that you are recommending. Simply that.
Thanks.
Yeah, and it's a question I find surprisingly kind of hard to answer. I may just say so before I came to Penn, I was at the World Bank working for the water practice there, which the World Bank is maybe the largest kind of single funder. Maybe that's not true, but certainly one of the largest single kind of funders of water infrastructure and things like that around the world. I kind of came out of that experience convinced that, of course, those institutions are still, will always be extremely important. I think the solutions to our water kinds of problems, they're going to come from engineers and financiers. There's currently kind of a little bit of a I think it's a fetishization around kind of water data and analytics. And I think some of that can be useful, but I think ultimately in terms of solving a lot of the water problems that we have, it's going to require more kind of traditional engineering, maybe, you know, nanomaterials and things like that as well. But I think it's going to require more traditional engineering expertise, and then just the financial kind of acumen to deploy technologies, particularly throughout the developing world, which of course is where you know, the bulk of the challenge lies. Not all of it, and certainly as Corinne could tell us, you know, our region has plenty of challenges with water access, affordability, and quality. But I think those two, kind of the technical and the financial sectors and specialties, are where I would advise people to look.
All right, well, I think that brings us to just about out of time here. I'd like to thank all the panelists for your interesting insights, and thank you, Mira, and everyone at GWA for having us here today.
Yeah, I'll say thank you, Allison, for facilitating that discussion. Thank you for all the speakers for, I again keep saying that I'm learning a lot, for just bringing these issues to bear and together. So really useful. One thing that I will offer for the engineering students, I mean, part of what's hard to think about where to go and how to incorporate climate justice or social justice into your work is that often you go to your career fairs and that's not who's there. And so it takes a little bit more effort to find those types of career paths. And I reiterate what Corinne said, is that you have to find your opportunities. And I would be more than happy to talk with anyone if you're thinking about that as you go forward. So please feel free to reach out. So with that, I see questions. So yes, this meeting is being recorded. All of the questions are being documented, and we will be asking our speakers to respond to them. Panel 1 has been graciously supplying some of those answers to us. So all of this will be made available on the GWA website. So at this time, we are going to switch gears. We're going to move into an interactive session. But we're going to start by, I'm honored to share a video that's being delivered to us by Mr. Abdoulaye Sane, who is co-president of the organizing committee and executive secretary of the 9th World Water Forum, scheduled for Dakar, Senegal in 2021. As mentioned earlier by Christian, we are really proud that this event is an official preparatory event for the forum. And what we hope to do in our conversations and in our interactive session that's coming up next is to spur partnerships and working groups that will contribute to the forum. And we have promised that we will submit a summary of this conference to the forum organizers. So I'm going to quickly share a video that was shared and sent to us by Mr. Sene. And then I will hand this over to Kelly Bridges, who will walk us through our breakout session.
Distinguished guests and participants, I would like to extend my warm greetings to all participants to the 2020 Global Water Alliance Conference on Water and Peace. I'm speaking with you from Dakar, capital city of Senegal, West Africa, where I hope to see you during the 9th World Water Forum. The global situation due to the COVID pandemic has made it impossible to be with you in person. My compassion and solidarity go to all those who have been impacted by this crisis. Allow me to thank Global Water Alliance for this opportunity to share and to congratulate them for their achievement in the field of water. Global Water Alliance is a strong contributing partner of the Dakar 2021 Forum through its contribution to discussion in the working groups, the organization of this On the Road to Dakar event, its participation to the initiative Dakar 2021. As you know, water resources and its benefits are essential to achieving the Sustainable Development Goals and building peace. Despite the fact that there are many tools for preventing, mitigating, and managing water-related conflicts, they are only implemented in very few basins around the world. To date, more than half of the shared international waters do not have an adequate framework for cooperation. The benefits of collaborative management of cross-border waters should therefore not only be measured in terms of direct economic gains, but in the benefits of averted conflicts. As you know, Senegal, during its presidency of the United Nations Security Council in November 2016, launched the first formal debate on water, peace, and security. It is in view of its commitment to hydrosecurity and hydrodiplomacy that the country has been awarded the organization of the 9th World Water Forum. The forum will address all these issues through its main theme, water security and peace and development. The goal of Senegal and the World Water Council is to organize a forum of the responses, a more effective forum at social, political, and economic levels. The forum will be connected with the SDGs agenda, platform and commitment, the Paris Climate Agreement, etc. The forum will focus on the following 4 priorities: water security and sanitation, cooperation, water for rural development, means and tools. The forum is built mainly around 3 components: a multi-actor platform of exchange, including sessions and expos, a summit of head of state and major international institutions, the initiative Dakar 2021 that aims to promote innovative and impacting projects. The success of the forum will be measured by its global reach, the strength of the political engagement emerging from the head of state summit, the quality of responses to water and sanitation issues showcased by the different stakeholders. To that end, we are hoping for a strong commitment from all stakeholders, mainly from public water utilities, private sector, research institutes, universities, young professionals to participate in the success of the forum. Finally, I would like to invite you to actively participate in the preparatory process and the organization of the forum. I very much hope that this forum, with your support, will contribute effectively to reach universal access to water and sanitation and to build a better world, a world of solidarity and resilience that leaves no one behind. Thank you for your attention.
So I hope many of you take that as an open invitation to participate and contribute to the forum. We will help facilitate that in some way in forming groups who want to prepare things for the forum in the future. So keep an eye out for that coming from the Global Water Alliance. So we're excited now to have Kelly Bridges here today to help us think through the tangible next steps in preparing for that water forum. Kelly is a senior associate at Global Water Alliance 2020 and will lead us all through a breakout session. We owe a great deal of thanks to Global Water Alliance 2020 from being a strong and consistent partner in this way and many other GWA events. So I will let Kelly take it from here.
Great, thank you, Mira, for the kind introduction. So as Mira mentioned, my name is Kelly Bridges, and I'm a senior associate at a DC-based advocacy and facilitation initiative called Global Water 2020, which aims to accelerate progress toward water security and sanitation for all. So it's really a pleasure to be joining you all this afternoon from DC for what I think will be a really engaging session. This breakout session, which we are calling Working Towards the World Water Forum 2021, will provide you with an opportunity to break through the chat box and chat with one another face-to-face, or at least the Zoom equivalent of that, as to reflect and build upon all the insightful discussions from earlier today. So very much in the spirit of the World Water Forum, you will be asked to consider not just the challenges around water and peace, but really the solutions that are needed to address and prevent water-related conflicts to sustain long-term peace. So 5 questions, and Kayla, if you could go to the next slide, please. So 5 questions were emailed in advance of today, which the breakout room facilitators will go over again with you, and can be accessed in the link I've just shared in the chat box. So each group will have 25 minutes to discuss at least one of these 5 questions. And then at the end of the 25 minutes, we will all return to plenary, where the facilitator will briefly share 1 to 2 key points from the discussion. So just a few housekeeping rules before we break into our groups. Firstly, when you enter the room, I encourage you all to turn on your videos for a more engaging discussion. Again, this is an opportunity to connect with your fellow conference attendees, and also will facilitate with the exchange of ideas. Secondly, while the chat box is available, I encourage you all to unmute yourself when you have a comment and jump right in. Thirdly, I ask that you please open up the link I've shared in the chat box so that you can follow along with the questions and discussions taking place in your own group and across the different rooms. So your facilitator may also ask for a volunteer to kindly take notes of the discussion within that link. Note takers do not need to worry about the attendees column, as this will be something our team behind the scenes will complete. And then finally, when it comes time to return to the plenary, please be careful not to click leave meeting, which will actually close you out of the conference. Instead, you should see one of 2 options, either leave breakout room or return to main session as to return to the plenary. So all right, let's get going and see you all in 25 minutes. Thank you.
Thank you, Kelly. So everyone, as you see the join breakout room, go ahead and click join. as expected, we were bumped mid-sentence. I hope many of you also left interesting conversations.
Yeah, and I think, Mira, are more people still filing in?
Hello.
Hi, Christian.
I think
Hi.
I can answer that. I think we're probably
We didn't come further than question 1. And I have to say that one of the two things that I think will stand out is the involvement of more people in the stakeholders in community level activities, making sure that you don't have minorities left out.
Yep.
And in the Colorado River, nobody has ever mentioned the Indian tribes. And you're talking about in insults that have been put there, man. Anyway.
So
why am I seeing Elaine and questions and nothing else?
Yeah, and I'm seeing you and questions and nothing else. But I will tell you that we started with question 5 in the group I was in, and we came up with the same ideas. Bringing in the local communities who are going to be expected to implement, bringing them in early in preparation and throughout the meeting, and also indigenous peoples from around the world.
Right. And communities are not monolithic, so you make sure that all stakeholders are involved.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, no one left behind, as they say.
As they say.
Great, and it's really wonderful actually to hear just a little bit of what's going on, I guess, between Christian's group and Eileen's group. So I think now we have pretty much everybody in the room. So I just like to thank you all for the excellent contributions that were made during the breakout rooms. I know I certainly benefited from hearing the diverse experiences and perspectives that are needed to solve this critical multifaceted challenge. So I'd like to turn it over to the facilitators to share briefly in 60 seconds or so, 1 to 2 key points from your breakout room. And please do note which question your group addressed. So maybe I could just turn it over to Maria to kind of kick things off on the discussion that we had in our group. Maria? Maria, I think you are on mute.
There you go. That's better. Everybody can hear me now. So I want to thank you, everybody, GWA and all the planning team. And Kelly also help you. Thank you so much for being on, taking off all of these wonderful sessions. And you were also in my group. So, so anyway, I wanted to kind of like address what we talk about it. We address question number 3. And our main takeaway points were that multi-track diplomacy is a useful tool, bringing together state and non-state actors to discuss these critical issues. We discussed a bit of Guatemala and also Sudan, South Sudan. And in Guatemala, some of our members were talking about how farming, different projects that EWB, Engineers Without Borders, have been in country and taking care of water issues, latrine issues, and water and sanitation. And one of the key things is that you need to talk to the stakeholders, you need to listen to the leaders, but also you need to provide an avenue for people with less of a voice. You also, it's so important to bring the power, the community, and consider all the stakeholders. And women in water is a thriving mechanism for change. So it's also really important to have good communications with all the parties involved. If you're just talking to the leaders, you're not getting the whole feel. It's important also when you're thinking about cholera abatement, for instance, it's very difficult to maintain and support a system around the water well system, but we need to the NGOs to be able to follow up with the projects. So NGOs need to have a take ownership of the project and be there for the whole time. So we need to also involve the non-medical community in the government system to realize that you need to address a scale from local to national. So thank you again. And I thought that was our main take points. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Maria. And I think that you did a great job explaining the conversation in our group. So I'll turn it over to Andrew and then afterwards to Christian. So Andrew, if you'd please.
Sure. A few interesting points from my group. We had a really good discussion. We talked about questions 1 and 2. So for question 1, talking about water and peace building, interesting point about land use. It's not just about like how the water is managed; it's how like you manage land, and then that affects water quality. We also talked about the importance of involving people at the local level, which is something we've talked about a lot today. And then we talked about water insecurity driven by factors other than climate change. For example, population growth can be a big factor towards driving water insecurity. For question number 2, talking about what groups are left out. We mentioned a lot of things that came up today, talking about women, minority groups, people of color. We also talked about participatory rural appraisal, which is something that I hadn't heard about before, but it sounds like it's a really important tool for bringing in rural communities and figuring out how they're affected by the plans that you're making. So really great discussion, and thanks to everyone who participated.
Great, thank you, Andrew. Christian, the floor is yours.
Yeah, we got more or less stuck in number 1, and then also a few things about the at 4. And the main point that we took from it is that water security can probably help when discussing conflicts in other areas, but it can also be the other way around, where you have solutions around a certain issue like energy, more energy and start fracking, you can create water conflicts. And so the notion of automatically seeing water security as a tool to work on other problems that can be around ethnic conflicts, social conflicts, educational conflicts, that by itself is not guaranteed. The underlying element is that what you have in water security is that a guaranteed system that everybody has access, and that can also apply to, for example, education, etc. So we like to see that kind of reciprocity being understood. And as such, it is not a valid question to apply all over the world without that remark. The other element that we thought is that when we talk community, we use too often a monolithic concept, and that when we talk community and community involvement, we really need to realize that in communities, we talk about shareholders and stakeholders from all angles. And that can be the disabled, that can be ethnic groups, that can be a language group. It can be all kinds of groups that are normally could have been left out in the political process, for example, but they need to be at the table when it comes to water governance or water structures. And that particular element of understanding that approach to communities is also pretty relevant in building the format around which you get then what you call the acknowledged stakeholders at the table, even higher up. And then of course, you don't have it within only one community, you have it also between communities. Philadelphia has something to say about what the wastewater treatment of Reading and upstream. So those kind of things and the organization of that, the inter-community dialogue needs to also be understood and brought forward. That's more or less where we got stuck, and took not enough time, especially with people like Ed and me, we talk a lot.
But it seems like a really interesting discussion, Christian. And I think, as your conversation, and I think Andrew's group really illustrates, there's a lot more work to be done to bring.
One particular part is that there are minorities that are ignored, the poor, etc., but overarchingly throughout the whole world, we see often the Aboriginal or the indigenous communities being ignored. And the Colorado River discussion is a perfect one. I never hear anybody saying anything about the Indian nations. And in Canada, you have the same complaint being heard over and over again.
Yeah, there's certainly a lot more that we can do to bring all these stakeholders to the table, as you said. So,
and acknowledge them.
Yep, yeah. So I know that time is short, but I do want to turn over to Mira, and then it'd be great to hear from Pam afterwards, then Patrick, and then Swati.
I will be quick, though our discussion was interesting and robust. So we did start with who's missing from the conversations, and we talked about women, we talked about indigenous groups, we talked about young people, we talked even about the geography. So bringing up the case of the Aral Sea. So it's remote, it's in a more rural area, and it's not as well represented because of its disconnectivity from where decisions are made and from center of knowledge. So then we focused in on what you have to do structurally to ensure that representation is actually representative and not tokenism. So if you're going to have women present, there ought to be childcare. If you're going to have indigenous groups present, like in the case of Colombia, they need to feel safe and protected, the social leaders. So all those different things that have to be provided structurally so that representation is actually possible and not just the privileged few who can actually make that step. So we went on from there a little bit, but I'll keep those as our highlights.
Great, thanks, Mira. Pam?
We talked about question 3, so, strategies for achieving peace, and some of the things that came up were having time for social connections between the decision makers was really important, because in the old days, before COVID, but even way before that, when we used to get together for conferences and things over a period of a few days, you got to meet each other and, learn a little bit about who you were meeting with, and that made the decisions and the things that you would do the day during the meeting easier, because you didn't feel like you were dealing with an adversary, you were dealing with a friend. Some of the other things we talked about, so the thing for that is to make time for personal connection, because that will lead to success. Stakeholder connections, to get rid of siloing, because it's hard to know the issues when you just come in with your one issue. And also maybe not to end run the government, but to include more people in the community, because the government can't come in and think that they know what they should do and make it all right for everyone, because they don't always know what right is. So you have to really have the community to be involved, just not government policies. There could be, Carol had given a thing about the Delaware River Basin and how fracking is still banned, and they had 69,000 comments from people, but there's short-term needs versus long-term vision, and some of the people who would have wanted fracking because they have this promise of making tons of money and are barely making money doing whatever, farming or whatever, how do you balance out all those needs? And we sort of segued into like Brazil and the Amazon rainforest, and how there's a resource that the world needs, but it's being used up because that country who owns it is, got the power to do whatever they want. Like, how do we make it so everybody can share their resources and not just, blow up what we have? Dialogue is key, obviously. If we don't sit down and listen to each other, and listening means listening, not just waiting for your turn to talk. And yeah, there was a few other things, but that was the gist of it.
Yeah, thanks, Pam. In the comments about Brazil, as a Brazilian American, I feel that really deeply. So,
well, maybe we should talk about it. Maybe we can figure it out.
And then I'd just like to turn it over to Patrick and Swati for their remarks.
Okay, so we kind of work backwards from question number 5, but then a lot of the points that other people discussed in their groups really came forward as well, and we took note that the World Water Forum itself may or may not happen next March. In all likelihood, we're going to hear very shortly that it's going to be delayed by 6 months to 12 months. And if that's the case, then really we think that the conference really kind of brought forth some very successful results, some case studies that could be utilized, and they should be utilized in the preparatory process ahead of the week-long meeting itself, so that people have a chance to really kind of think about these and delve into them and draw the successful results that some of these more successful case studies did bring out. So we think that there's going to be an opportunity for that, and we really feel that that should be highlighted. And then we talked about who the composition should be, and Eileen in particular, but this was really reinforced by everyone else in the group, that the indigenous population is not consulted in sufficient manner, is not really held accountable, and their voice to the others is really an important ingredient, because over the years they have been the ones that have been suffering the most in these occasions, and they should be brought to the table and listened to much more closely than they have in the past. Mm-hmm. So that pretty much summarizes our main points.
Thanks, Patrick. And lastly, Swati, it'd be great to hear from you.
So we mostly touched on question number 4 and a little bit of question 5. So I think it's focused on subnational conflicts, and at subnational level, I think the major takeaway from discussion was that there is a right of way for marginalized groups, and we have to find a way to involve these communities somehow, because some of these communities may not even know that there is a problem with respect to water and water security. So, most of our discussion was around actually developing educational and communication materials in a way these communities can be involved in some of these conversations. Educational materials such as the materials developed in their own language, and also reaching out to local media and newspapers and start a dialogue about these problems. And once you initiate these conversations and made communities aware of the problem and then expand on that. So basically taking this bottom-up approach and really understanding layers of stakeholders and understanding how these different layers interact while making some of these decisions, or just involving this, taking this bottom-up approach during some of these peace building processes. I think that was the major takeaway. It was mostly around communication.
Mm-hmm. Communication. Mm-hmm.
Great, thank you, Swati, and thank you all really for such engaging discussions, and to our facilitators, the note takers, and then special gratitude to Vivian, Erica, and Kayla for helping behind the scenes with your support. I definitely wish I had been in all these breakout rooms, really interesting. And just before we conclude the session and I turn it back to Mira, I wanted to provide a quick plug for those interested in engaging further with this morning and afternoon's discussion. So Kayla, if you could, yeah, thank you. So as we look to the World Water Forum next year in Senegal, the conference organizers will be developing a modern day toolkit for water and peace, looking at solutions across sectors. If you're interested in joining a volunteer working group around this, please do contact the Water Center at Penn, watercenter@sas.upenn.edu. The email is on the slide and will also be emailed to participants after. And I should stress that this opportunity is for any and all interested. It is not limited to those just affiliated with Penn. So I encourage you to reach out and get involved. So thank you all so much and enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to everyone for attending. As a representative for Peace Engineering, it's really been a pleasure to work with Global Water Alliance and the Penn Water Center on this. We really appreciate your participation, particularly in this last session. We thank all of our sponsors. We're seeing all your questions come in about recordings and certificates, and we will be issuing all of those. Check back with our website. And we'll take note of who requested a certificate, and we'll follow back up with that. I will open it up if Christiane or Vivian want to do any closing remarks.
Okay, I can make one closing remark. Hello, anyway, I am very pleased with this particular way we did things. I have learned a lot from listening to these two panels and the enthusiasm in the breakout sessions. It is totally different than being in phase and together and all that. But it was this particular one beyond my expectations. I really hope that we can work on this. I hope that there will be some blogs coming out, some conversations and some correspondences, perhaps even some research projects to go forward. And definitely, I hope to see several of you guys in Dakar whenever the World Water Forum will happen. Thank you.
Okay, thank you and take care, everyone.
Bye now.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye,
Bye,
Mary
everyone.
Day.